Right.
Let's get started. Sorry for the delay. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
It's nice to have a full council chamber. So, let's all stand for a moment of personal reflection. Thank you. May I ask Councillor Gardner to lead us in the singing of the national anthem?
I'm gonna get the water out of my lungs. Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all of us command. Car ton bras sait porter l'épée, il sait porter la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée, et plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Merci, Conseiller Gardner.
Bienvenue, Madame la mairesse.
We acknowledge that we are gathering on the traditional territory of the Mohawk people of Akwesasne. Madam Clerk, roll call, please.
Mayor Bernadette Clement.
Présent.
Councillors Claude McIntosh.
Present.
Elaine McDonald.
Present.
Sid Gardner.
Here.
Ian Hollingsworth.
Present.
Adeline Hébert.
Présente.
Councillors Modeste Dupel.
Present.
Glenn Grant.
Present.
Todd Bennett.
Present.
Justin Towndale.
Present.
And David Bergeron.
Present.
All present, Madam Mayor.
Merci. Additions, deletions, or amendments? Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to move item 12 from consent into communications, please.
Thank you. Councillor Grant.
I'd like to move item 3 consent to presentation.
Item 3.
12.
Anyone else? Madam Clerk.
We're going to go ahead with the unfinished business number 1, the new cat control bylaw as part of the city community cat population control partnership strategy before we go on to the consent item and the presentation.
Okay.
Everyone okay with that?
Yeah, sure.
We have a presentation from the lawyer. He's just arrived, and it's just a little, so we're going to start with the presentation on the cat bylaw, if that's okay with everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next item, Madam Clerk.
The adoption of the agenda as amended.
So I would need a motion. Councillor Grant and Councillor Bennett. Any discussion? All in favor? Any disclosure of interest? Seeing none. A motion for going to committee of the whole. Councillor Gardner, Councillor McIntosh. All in favor? Carried. We have several minutes, Madam Clerk.
We have the minutes of June 19th, June 26th, July 8th, July 22nd, and July 29th.
We can do one motion for all.
Yes, Madam Mayor, we can.
Anybody want to move the minutes? Councillor Hébert, Councillor Dupel. Any discussion on any of those minutes? Councillor Bergeron.
Thank you. The July 8th minutes state that the energy conservation report will be brought back today. It is not brought back today. I'd like to know why.
Madam CAO.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So there's still a little bit of work being done on the report. Also to, I think, given the number of reports that are on the agenda tonight, between our efforts to get it on the next meeting as well as the length of the agenda, we are going forward on the September 9th council meeting.
Okay, thank you.
Is that satisfactory?
It is.
Thank you. Any other comments concerning the minutes? All in favor? Carried. Thank you.
So then, our item is the new cat control bylaw as part of the city community cat population control partnership strategy, with the action recommended that council adopt the recommendations to implement a cat control bylaw composed as presented and vitally supported by funding for A, the desexing of feral community cats as a component of community-involved trap, neuter, release activity, and B, subsidized income-tested desexing procedures for qualifying households in support of a bylaw prescribed 5-year timeline in which all owned cats are to be desexed.
Madam CEO, do you want to throw it to city administration for an introduction?
Certainly, thank you, Madam Mayor. And I think that following our previous council meeting, council was looking for an update on this matter this evening. So we have a report in front of council. The intention, following the report this evening, depending on the feedback we receive from council, we will follow up and have a bylaw brought back at a future meeting. So we don't officially have the bylaw on this evening's agenda. We have recommendations that we'd like to put in that bylaw for council's consideration. And then perhaps, Madam Mayor, if I might, I think I would like to ask Mr. Christopher Rogers if he would just maybe speak to highlight some of the items that are in the report this evening.
Through you, Madam Mayor. It's a two-pronged initiative. One is aimed at trying to control Cornwall's community cat population. Control it by way of providing subsidies to income-tested households who may happen to see a feral cat around their property, and that they would meet the income test that that they could take have a few options, but one would be to take the cat to the OSPCA or to vet and have it desexed, with that procedure being supported through a subsidy. Now, that would be based on their income test only. To be clear, there is no lump sum amount in here, like the City of Kingston, for argument's sake. The City of Kingston has chosen to deal with community cats, at least in last year, by affording the community animal welfare groups a $25,000 lump sum. And they seem to do that annually. So that's given to the animal welfare organizations who use it as they see fit. There's no such in here. However, there is an allocation for 65 vouchers on an annual basis. And the idea is that that would be divvied up amongst the various organizations that are known to us, and there's 2 or 3, and that those organizations would use those vouchers in support of TNR initiative. So that's community cats. The other prong is cutting off the population supply of community cats. A community cat or feral cat, it's initiated by a domestic cat, your cat, my cat, that goes roaming and for whatever reason does not return. It breeds with other community cats and it fuels that population. So a key element, 2 key elements in fact, in the bylaw, in the proposed bylaw. One, that all cats are to be kept indoors, all household cats. So that's meant to give immediate effect to the problem of roaming cats. Keep in mind that according to SPCA statistics, while we place a lot of emphasis on community cats and feral cats, they are 30% of the problem. And that's not to belittle that problem. It's a major problem. But approximately 70% of the problem is roaming cats. So that's you, me, you know, we're all used to letting our cats out, and sometimes, of course, they don't return. You know, they may be hurt, they may be killed, or someone is feeding them, or they've roamed off somewhere. So it's important to stem that supply by requiring all cats to be kept indoors. Secondly, it's vital, of course, in all of this, what's key is having the cats desexed. And it doesn't matter if they're feral cats or community cats, it doesn't matter if they're household cats, because that is the ultimate population control measure. And to support that, I'm proposing, or staff is proposing, that we allocate, I think it was about $11,000 to support the desexing of owned cats on an income-tested basis. Because the bylaw does require, or I propose that the bylaw require that all household cats be desexed within 5 years.
Those are your comments?
That's
Okay.
my document. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. So we have a recommendation here, and I'd like to go to council for a motion before we can start discussion on some of the highlights that were described by Mr. Rogers. Any motion? Yes, Councillor Bennett?
Sorry, this is for question?
We want to put a motion on the table and then have debate. So the motion, maybe I'll go to Madam Clerk to review the motion or the recommendation from administration, and council could then take it from there or not, to put a motion on the table.
So the recommendation is that council adopt the recommendations to implement a cat control bylaw composed as presented and vitally supported by funding for A, the desexing of feral or community cats as a component of community-involved trap, neuter, release activity, and B, subsidized income-tested desexing procedures for qualifying household in support of a bylaw prescribed 5-year timeline in which all owned cats are to be desexed.
Move that.
Councillor Bennett, you're making that motion? Councillor Grant, you're seconding? Debate.
I have a question, Madam Mayor, may I, before we start debate?
Councillor Abad?
Does this include the part of the bylaw that would keep all cats indoors? I'm not seeing that in the two recommended items.
So my understanding is that this is not the passing of the bylaw tonight. We have not yet been presented with the bylaw. So the recommendation is that a bylaw come forward with these elements in it.
Okay, so we're not necessarily debating the cats must stay indoors component, just these two to then be forwarded to a bylaw to then come back to us at a later date.
You could certainly speak to that tonight,
If-
but my understanding is that a bylaw will come back before council, and we will have another opportunity to debate the fine points within the bylaw.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Councillor, I think Councillor McDonald had her hand up first, then Councillor Hollingsworth.
Sure.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I have a couple of questions of Mr. Rogers, if I may, through you.
Yes.
Do I understand you to mean that all cats must be desexed, even, this wouldn't be a grandfather situation? For example, if somebody has a cat and they've had it for 10 years, that cat too must be desexed? Or-
You, Madam Mayor, that's correct, Councilor McDowell.
Thank you. And then my second question is this. There are some people who control their cats, but in their yard through leashes and that sort of thing. Would that be permissible when you say cats must be kept inside? As long as they were controlled in their own yard, would you accept that, or?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's about supervising your cat.
Okay.
That you're outside with your cat and you have it in your lap, or you have it on a tether, and some cats, of course, don't respond well to being tethered, so that you would have it on your lap, or you would have it on a tether, or you would have it in a contained area outside. So it's really about ensuring that once the cat is
Yes.
outside, that it's supervised.
Yes, yeah. Well, I appreciate all the work you did in putting this report together. I know you've been working on it for a long time, and I know there's a great difference between dogs and cats, but there was a time when dogs roamed free as well. And that obviously has been remedied, and I wish all of us well on controlling the cats. Thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth?
Thank you, Your Worship. So, Mr. Rogers, if I look at the report, so page 258, 259, page 260, there's a number of, like, block print, I guess we'll call them, is that safe to say, recommendations?
I'm sorry, mine is not numbered, but.
Okay. So bestow ownership on individuals who
Yes.
intentionally, like,
Yes.
they're all kind of blocked.
That's correct.
Okay, so is it safe to say then that that would kind of be the cornerstone of our cat bylaw, each one of these recommendations?
Through you, Madam Mayor, they are the cornerstones of the
Okay.
bylaw, that's correct.
So that gets me to the, I think it's the final question. How do we realistically expect to enforce some of these provisions? I mean, to say, all cats have to be kept indoors. Well, if there's a random cat wandering in the neighborhood, how do we know who officially owns that cat? Are we gonna give this person a ticket? Are we gonna, sort of try to, how does that work?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's why it's vital that the cats be licensed. And so hopefully that cat that's roaming, much like we have roaming dogs with no identification on them, hopefully that cat that is roaming can be linked to its owner by virtue of a tag, which is purchased much as you buy a tag to license your dog on an annual basis.
Okay, now one last question, on the one with regards to bestow ownership on individuals who intentionally attract, feed, house, community roaming cats. So somebody feeds a random cat, we're gonna say, you're now the owner, you have to get a license, you have to take care of, neuter it or whatever, you're just gonna decide that? And that's based on somebody, the neighbor calling and saying, Mr. Johnson is feeding this cat, so I think it's his cat now, is that how that one works?
That's it in a global concept form. The issue is, or what the intent of this bylaw is, particularly the subsidies, the subsidies that support the bylaw, is that you have some options now. So if you were to see a roaming cat, if it does have an identity tag on it, if you can catch it, of course, there's no guarantee, but at least it's linking it to an owner. If it appears to be a feral cat, and you could try to catch it, I'm proposing, in fact, that we buy 10 or 12 cages, and much as I think the OSPCA has done, they will often say to property owners, oh, there's cats roaming now, and so on and so forth. Here's a cage, and if you can catch cats, put them in the cage, and that's a good start.
Last question. You made reference to $11,000. That's just for the two provisions. TNR is recognized in North America for its effective humane, and then the subsidized income testing, desexing procedures. So those two components of the motion, is that $11,000? Did I understand that correctly?
Just bear with me a sec.
So how much is it going to cost us initially for the first two things that it looks like we're going to do?
Just bear with me here. So the grand plan is to allocate $40,000. $40,000 in support of, in various forums, in support of desexing household cats, own cats, and in support of desexing feral cats. Because the key to controlling the cat population is ensuring that they are desexed.
Okay. One last point. Is it safe to say then at $40,000 we're going to start implementing that, assuming that council agreed, that would start as of next year because it has to be allocated into the budget somehow, or?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's the anticipated plan, that we would consider this in the budget preparation for 2020, and that a bylaw would be in place for January 1 of 2020, supported by subsidies.
Okay, thank you. Your Worship, I'm not completely convinced we can necessarily implement all these regulations. However, that being said, it would seem we have a problem. We need to sort of initiate some sort of action. So that being said, I'll support the motion. I'll wait and kind of let the bylaw kind of flesh itself out. A little part of me thinks we may not be so successful at some of these things, but we've got to start somewhere, so I'll support the motion.
Thank you. Councillor Bergeron and then Councillor Grant.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I support the motion as it's written, but I have a few questions and I don't know who to ask them to.
We'll figure it out.
Yeah, we're talking about de-sexing cats in a household. Are we as a council allowed to do that? Is that a law that we're allowed to pass? I don't know. I really don't know who to ask that question to.
Mr. Rogers is on his feet.
Oh, you're ready.
My original concern when I came up with that concept would have been, or was that, some may ask the question, is this humane? And the answer, the resounding answer that I have received from animal interest groups, the likes of the OSPCA and others, is that yes, that in fact, it's a misconception, as I include in my report, it's a misconception that cats need to roam and that they somehow suffer negatively if they are restrained to the indoors or the outdoors as long as they're supervised. In fact, it's quite the contrary.
So let me be a little more general. I appreciate the answer. That kind of answered the question, but are we allowed to tell people that they have to de-sex their cat? Do we have a council have that right? It sounds like a very challengeable thing. I don't have an issue with the motion. I actually support the motion. I'm just really curious is that we as a city council can tell people they have to de-sex their cat within 5 years. And maybe it's a legal opinion, but
So, Mr. Rogers is still on his feet.
Through you, Madam Mayor, at a very high level, this has been run by our legal counsel. And of course, any significant bylaws, of course, the concepts and so on and so forth. Before spinning our wheels to write a bylaw, we would want to address the cornerstones of the bylaw to legal counsel to make sure that we're not overstepping our boundaries.
and we are not.
I don't believe so, sir.
Thank you. Next question. There's a limit on pets per household, so we're allowed to have 5 cats per house. Is that correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, we have an animal control bylaw at present, and a bit of a misnomer, it's really a dog control bylaw. It addresses cats in one avenue. It basically says that you're allowed up to 5 domestic pets, and in the context of that bylaw, a domestic pet is a cat or a dog. And it says, oh, by the way, you're allowed 2 dogs. So by deduction, if you have 2 dogs, you're allowed 3 cats. If you have no dogs, you could have 5 cats.
It doesn't sound like a bylaw to me, to be honest. That is kind of my question. Is there a bylaw that says you can only have 5 cats in the city of Cornwall?
By deduction, through you, Madam Mayor, yes, the animal control bylaw says that on condition that you have no dogs, you can have 5 cats. If you have 1 dog, you'd have 4 cats. If you have 2 dogs, which is the maximum, you can have 3 cats.
Fair enough, thank you. My next question is about license fee. Where does that license fee go? What happens to the $30 or $15 if you qualify, or $10 if you qualify? I read the report. What happens? Where does that money go, and how does it help people who are actually paying a license? I would ask the same question for dog owners. You're paying a license fee. Where is that going?
Licensing, of course, would be it dogs or cats. It's a part of animal welfare. The idea is that if a dog goes roaming and it's licensed, we can link it to an owner, so it can be returned to the owner. But without that association, the dog, who knows, ends up with the OSPCA or another animal shelter, and it then burdens their resources. So it's about animal welfare primarily, and the issue with cats right now, and this is not about Cornwall, this is universal. We've come to accept dogs as members of the family. We treat them like our kids sometimes. Cats, unfortunately, are still often seen as disposable. That we have a cat and it walks away, disappears, doesn't, we let it out at night, doesn't come back next morning. Well, we know someone down the street who has a cat that just had a litter, and they're only too happy to give us a replacement cat. So we've got to break that, and that's long term. That's a change in culture. That's a change in thinking.
May I rephrase the question?
Yes, go ahead.
We're suggesting in this bylaw that we're collecting fees for licensing of cats.
That's correct.
What will that money go towards, and is it towards this project of helping fix the cat situation?
Through you, Madam, to fix the cat situation again, it's about animal welfare. One, that if the cat is seen roaming, and we can link it to an owner, then the cat can be returned to the owner, not become another community cat, or end up being injured or the likes. And secondly, like any program, the revenues are partially intended to, in some measure, offset the operation of that animal welfare program.
The answer is yes. If I'm understanding, the answer is yes. If we collect fees for licensing cats, it is to help offset the costs of paying for this program.
It's to help offset the cost of what basically is an animal welfare program, much as we do for dogs now.
Thank you. That answers the question. Thank you.
Pleasure, sir.
Councillor Grant and then Councillor Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I was going to talk about enforcement, but Councillor Hollingsworth, as usual, we think a lot alike.
Oh, boy.
Maybe.
One thing I want to think about is long-term. And if everybody's religious in this, we won't have a cat problem because we won't have any cats. When you think about it. So, I mean, that is extreme, but at the same time, if everybody follows this religiously, eventually there'll be no more cats in the community. I think there has to be some kind of balance there.
Through you, Madam
How
Mayor.
that could be achieved, but
Through you, Madam Mayor, no bylaw is 100% enforceable. I speak to something that everyone understands. There's a speed limit out here in front of this building. It's 50 kilometers an hour. I'm sure if I asked everyone in this room if they have exceeded that 50 miles an hour, if they were honest, they'd say yes.
Miles?
So I would say to them, I would ask the question next, oh, were you caught? And I'd be surprised if they were caught. So if we use that logic, why do we have speed limits? So bylaws.
back to enforcement again.
Exactly. So you could argue that, well, I mean, the police chief isn't here, but you could argue that the police chief isn't doing his job, and that's not the case. Bylaws, speed limits, they build expectation. It's a community expectation. And certainly there's that carrot that says, oh, if you don't live up to that expectation, there could be punitive repercussions.
Well, I second the motion because I agree we have to get proactive. We've been talking about this for how many years now, and I think it's time that we do something. Either do something or don't do anything, but something has to be done, and I think this is a good solution to it. Good start. Thank you.
Sir?
I have Councillor Bennett and then Councillor McIntosh.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to Mr. Rogers. The 5-year time frame to have the cats desexed. Why 5 years? It seems like that's a long time. If somebody told me that we're going to do is desexing, if I had a year or two notice, I think that'd be enough for me. Is that budgetary?
Well, through you, Madam Mayor, it's budgetary on the part of our community because desexing is expensive. Depending on the vet, I've heard anything from $140 to over $300. Cornwall, we have a bit of a challenge here with family incomes. It's below the Ontario average. So much as I would like to say, yeah, personally, that 1 year, I don't think it's practical. I mean, unless council had a massive infusion of funds to support it. So 5 years, it's a long time. but to compress that, I think we're asking a bit much of.
We can.
Yeah, you can, so it's basically budgetary.
It's budgetary on the part of the members of our community to afford to do this.
Okay. Okay. One of the questions, question number 6 that was asked, one of the responses was people were worried about not feeding the stray cats. Could you explain a little bit why that's, why feeding the stray cats is actually a bigger problem than feeding them?
While feeding a stray cat?
Yeah, so these feral cats people are feeding, we're saying, okay, we're gonna own it. So people are saying, well, I'm doing it because it's compassionate to the cat. Is it actually compassionate to the cat, or is it actually causing a bigger problem in the long run?
Well, no one wants to see a cat or dog starve.
Right.
And so well-intentioned people are doing what is humane. They're feeding strays. However, a cat, like a dog, food is part of their welfare, but there's a lot more to it than that. And secondly, as exhibited in certain areas in this city, what's happening, well-intentioned people are causing stress to their neighbors because cats can be very destructive. Well, any animal can be, but I mean a cat, you know, defecation, noise. So this is meant to give people options, to make that decision to say, oh, right, what am I going to do with this stray cat? Well, I like the cat, I'll take it in, and it'll become mine. And if you do that, you have to desex it. And you have to care for it. Okay. If you don't want to do that, you're looking at some options. If you meet the income subsidy test, you can simply take it to a vet or the OSPCA, and you surrender your voucher. So you'll have 3 vouchers per household per year. So you will simply hand that to the vet, to the service provider, and say, here, that is intended, the $140 is intended to subsidize the cost of that procedure. So this is the first time that you have options if, you know, you see stray cats around your property. And be they household cats, own cats, or be they feral cats or community cats.
Okay. The other question I had is, in your bylaw, there's 5 domestic animals, but only 2 dogs. So why are we only allowed 2 dogs, but I can have 5 cats? I'm not sure why we wouldn't just be allowed to have 2 cats if I can only have 2 dogs.
I can't answer to that, unfortunately. That was a bylaw amendment implemented some 15 years ago.
Right. So if we want to do something about it, now would be the time to suggest we maybe look at that?
Yeah.
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, well, should this bylaw be implemented, any reference to cats will be removed from the so-called animal control bylaw.
Okay.
So at that time, we could say, fine, 2 dogs, that stands. Or we can choose some other number.
Right.
Because this cat control bylaw will dictate how many cats are allowed in a household. But obviously, considering that cats and dogs commonly coexist in a household.
Right. I just find it hard to understand why we would be allowed to have more cats than dogs. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I don't know if there's a way we can look at that for the bylaw when it comes forward, because I know the bylaw is 5 domestic animals, but it just seems odd that I could have more cats than dogs.
Well, through you, Madam Mayor, again, if this is implemented, the animal control bylaw will be amended to remove that prescription for up to 3 cats.
Okay.
So that the animal control bylaw, which is really a dog control bylaw,
Right.
will simply provide for 2 dogs.
Okay.
That's it. It won't speak to cats anymore.
Okay. So if it doesn't speak to dogs, or so it's still only speaking to dogs, and it's not speaking to cats, so how many cats can I have?
Well, I'm proposing that if you live in an apartment type dwelling,
Right.
2 cats max.
Okay.
And if you live in a single family row house, semi, 3 cats max.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification, because there were so many different numbers here. I was kind of getting
That's
lost
okay.
swimming around in those. Okay, that's, I think, that's all I had for you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thank you. Councillor McIntosh and then Councillor Towndale.
How long have you been with the bylaw department, Chris? I bet you never had one like this and bring it to, what,
A few
10 TV
years.
stations and whatnot. It's not a perfect bylaw, but, glad the only one person caught that. But,
Oh,
it's,
perfect.
it's a step in the right direction.
Oh, yikes, just got that, sorry.
Yeah. I have, some
Good clean.
enforcement, as Dean Hollingsworth mentioned, that is a massive problem. I don't think it can be enforced. Your department doesn't work nights, and that's, cats are nocturnal, the ones that roam, you don't see them in the daytime too often.
Again, most municipalities have dog control bylaws. And, if you were to ask them, well, how actively do they enforce it? They'd probably be embarrassed to answer. Keep in mind, too, that most bylaws, most municipalities enforce bylaws in a reactive manner, not a proactive. The City of Cornwall leads the way somewhat in the property standards world by proactively enforcing property standards related bylaws. But all other bylaws, like any other municipalities, are reactive, so we respond to complaints. We're not out there actively looking for bylaw infractions.
You know, a cat wanders through your backyard and you call the city and tell them, not, by the time you get there, it's gone, long gone.
Well, through you, Madam Mayor, we have the same problem with dogs, but yeah, cats tend to be a bit more limber than a dog can be and evasive.
When it comes to, we've got 7,000 cats. I don't know how we came to this figure. Reside in Cornwall's 21,000 households. How do we arrive at that figure?
That's through you, Madam Mayor. That's a Canada-wide, the Canadian Federation of Households or something like that. That's just them saying on the average, X number of percentage of households in a given city have cats.
So a lot of people must have more than one cat. If I went around this table, I doubt very much if more than 2 or 3 councillors have cats.
I would say that is a very, that number is highly underestimated, but I have to start somewhere.
I live in the West End, and we don't have a roaming cat problem that I know of. Which area, is there an area in town where it's more concentrated and more concerned and where this bylaw would really be effective?
It's in more densely populated neighborhoods in the city of Cornwall. Lots of multifamilies and so on and so forth. So if you take a fourplex at this time, going back to how many cats and how many dogs are allowed, if you've got a fourplex, you've got 4 households in there, and assuming you have no dogs, you've got 20 cats in 50 by 100. That's a fourplex lot. While in Riverdale or Emer's Corners, that 50 by 100 lot supports one single family dwelling.
Okay. One other question is that I think we have one animal hospital in Cornwall. Am I correct?
Through you, Madam Mayor, that's correct.
And they have 5 vets on duty, I think.
I think that's correct, sir.
Would there be a possibility of an overload here if this actually worked? And all at once the phone's ringing and everybody wants to bring their cat down because they're going to be subsidized?
I sort of, that's a possible outcome.
Yeah.
I speak about bottlenecks in here because I fear that, and this comes back to the generous 5 years in which a cat is, I propose a cat's supposed to be desexed. Because if we compress that, we're just going to put more stress on the available resources.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's a step in the right direction, and you're ready to take on rabbits next.
Councillor Towndale and Councillor Dupel.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. A lot of my concerns were addressed by Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Grant in that regard, and Councillor McIntosh. I think the biggest challenge we're going to face is the enforcement challenge, to be fair. I won't spend too much time on it because we've already talked about it. I do like most of what's in here. There's funding to remedy the problem. There's guidelines in here. 5 years does seem like a long time, but I can understand why you've implemented it, why you're suggesting that for a number of reasons. I think, the biggest challenge we're going to be facing here is preventing cats from going outside. I think that's going to be difficult to enforce. And I think the feeding aspect of it too. Actually, Mac, we do have strays in Riverdale. My neighbor feeds
stay
a
away from
couple.
mine.
Yeah, yeah. I'll drop them off at your house. But no, but in seriousness, my neighbor feeds a couple stray cats, and I do find them on my property. I don't really care. I mean, I'm slightly allergic, but it's not a big deal to me. But my concern there, for example, let's say there's a misunderstanding, for example, like, okay, he's got food out, and then the cat's on my property, and someone else calls and says, oh, well, you know, Councillor Townsend is feeding a stray cat. That's his cat now. He's got to take care of it. So I think that's going to be a challenge, and I'm not in favor of people cutting that off entirely. But I do like what you said, where people, if they're able to trap the cat safely, I might add, because if we're talking about feral cats, we do have to be careful. That's something to stress. But they can bring it to animal hospital with a voucher to say, hey, you know, I've trapped this feral animal. It needs to be desexed. I think that's important. I like the fact that we have cages that will be available for people to do that, but again, as long as they can do it under safe conditions. Because I don't want someone going out and getting hurt realistically. But I don't want to repeat your pun, Mac. It's not a perfect bylaw, but there's a lot here that I think is valuable. It's interesting to see, and I think this was very valuable that you put this in here, Mr. Rogers, but the different communities that have funds available for this, because we hear a lot about Cornwall's issue with this. It seems like it's not just a Cornwall problem, even though we've made national media in the last couple of years. So, you know, it's nice to see that we're not alone in this struggle, but there's also a precedent here because it gives us a better understanding of what we need to do and how to do it.
Thank you. Councillor DePell and then Councillor Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to just start off by thanking Mr. Rogers, because it was the last council meeting that I asked that maybe we could get this report sooner than later, and I realized there's lots of information and research that went into this, so thank you for the report. I think that it's clear that we need to stop putting blinders on. It's a problem wherever you live in the city. It's a problem. It might be heavier in some areas and not heavier. I've spoken to lots of taxpayers who say I don't want to spend money on that, but I think that if we want to try and fix the problem, we need to start as we're starting here, and we need to invest some money into the program. I think that when we talk about enforcement, yes, it's going to be very hard to enforce, but if we're able to enforce it by 25%, there's a huge reduction in what the problem is that we're facing right now. So I think that City Council needs to get on board. I fully support this, and I look forward to debating the bylaw and things that need to come in and go out of it, but I'm very pleased to see it actually get to this level, and I want to thank everybody for their time and effort that was put into it.
Councillor Gardner and then Councillor Ibay.
Thank you very much. I spent 2 or 3 hours on the agenda, but on the cat bylaw issue. This has been going on since, I think I was on council 15 years ago, and we were talking about feral cats then. Something has to be done, and we're going to do it tonight. The bylaw will come later on. I'm a former cat owner. Mine passed away. And as far as the Riverdale is concerned, it wasn't too long ago I went into my shack where I store all my tools for gardens and that, and 6 little kittens came out with moss. So it's not just in the East End, it's everywhere. I don't know what happened to those kittens. I felt bad because she disappeared with them. They could have died, they could have been taken by foxes. We need to stop what's going on now. We need to stop the feral cat problem, and I will fully support this recommendation. Thank you very much for the information. It was amazing. It was a lot of reading, but it was worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Ibay?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that have already been said. I'm really happy with what I'm seeing here. There's a couple of pieces that I suppose I oppose, and I think that will come back when the bylaw comes back, and I'll get a chance to debate that. But a couple of comments. I really love the term community cat instead of feral cat, because that's how I see them. And this whole bestowing of ownership situation, I think that's something that we should certainly debate when this comes back. I would be owner of quite a few if this were to pass, and I'm severely allergic. So it's the only way I can have a cat through a patio door window. So I think there's a lot of, like it was mentioned, a lot of people in our community that don't want to see our community cats go hungry and may feed them, and I don't think that means they should take on the responsibility. If they can capture them and bring them to be desexed, that's fantastic, and then release them again, great. If I could do that, I would do that for the ones that hang around in my private yard where no one would be able to tell the bylaw officers on me, so I guess it's okay. So I'd like to debate that a little further. I also think 5 years is a little long. I understand the reasoning why, but I think 3 years might be fair, because we want to make sure we nip this in the butt as soon as possible. So I think 5 years is a little bit delayed. And I think it's going to be very difficult for the enforcement of keeping them indoors. I've seen indoor-outdoor cats that, can interact very well with the outdoor cats and the environments. I think it's going to be very difficult to tell those owners that they can no longer put their cats outside. So again, things that we can debate further, but really the meat behind this, these recommendations, I certainly support. I'm glad we're putting some budget dollars behind this because it's time that we address this. So I'm really grateful that it's come to us now and look forward to seeing the complete bylaw.
Any further debate? I think everybody's spoken, but I had Councillor Elaine McDonald want to ask a
Thank you, Madam.
question.
It's just a question, and I'm glad that, Mr. Rogers, you clarified that 70% of the problem are domestic cats and 30% are feral cats or community cats. I'm presuming that if somebody were to trap a feral cat and take it to the vet with a subsidy or without, would the cat also receive rabies shots and that sort of thing? I would certainly hope so, because
Through you, Madam Mayor, certainly if you were to take the cat to USPCA, that's the rule.
that's just,
Yes.
okay.
And I've outreached to some members of the rescue groups and animal welfare groups here, and again, all depends on the vet. I'm told for approximately $140, $150. If it's a male cat, female cats are more expensive. That you could have the desection procedure done plus vaccinations, plus.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before calling for the vote, I'd like to highlight that we have attached a survey to this report. And it is remarkable, that survey. Remarkable because there's been such engagement around this issue, more than on many other topics that we ask the community about. So I want to take note of that and highlight that there are many people in the room tonight, that there are many people who have engaged with us on a regular basis on this issue. And I thank you for your engagement. This is what we want from a community. This council is not going to be able to be successful if we don't get engagement back from the community. So kudos to you for that. I will say, as Councillor Towndale said, that it was very good to see that chart comparing what other cities are doing. This is not just a Cornwall issue. This is an issue that affects many communities, and it was very important, Mr. Rogers, for us to see what other communities are doing. So I really did appreciate that. And I like your use of the words, it's about building community expectations. So it's about setting some standards around this. Yes, enforcement is going to be an issue, as it is in so many of our bylaws. But when you set a bylaw, you're setting a tone, you're sending a message to the community about how you want this issue to be treated. So it's about building community expectations. And I'm very pleased to know from your timeline that we're going to be looking at a bylaw by January 1st so that we can discuss this and put this into the 2020 budget. I'll say now that the amount of $40,000 seems quite reasonable to get things started. So I am very pleased with the discussion that we had around the table, very respectful. A few, inappropriate puns. Councillor Mack, perfect report. Oh, my goodness.
Council meeting. Appropriate.
But I respect that it was a very dignified conversation. I appreciate that, and I know that we'll keep that tone as we go into further discussions around the bylaw when it's presented to us. So I'm going to call the vote. All in favor? Carried. Thank you. Madam Clerk.
Madam Mayor, I wonder if our presenter is ready to join us.
CFO, can you call in our presenter?
Going to stay.
I don't even, I'm gonna ask the question. Why we haven't?
You guys can stay.
We did.
A lot of really cool stuff after this.
It was
Thank you for attending the council meeting.
Point of order?
No.
We adopt the minutes?
Did we have them here?
Right.
We did?
So we're just waiting for our presenter to come talk to us about our local purchasing policy. And that's Mr. David Sheriff Scott.
Really interesting stuff.
I think we'll be going by the slides because these are
Nobody has to bow, it's
upside
fine.
down.
Eric,
But thank you, that's very lovely. Our council appreciates that.
Me too. Through a window.
Only through windows.
I'm around one. Hi. Very good.
That was for David as he entered.
So how, Sheriff Scott, how do you like coming into a council meeting, getting a hand like that?
David, those cheers were for you.
People cheered when you arrived.
So
Oh, thank you. I'm not used to cheers.
Welcome to council, Mr. Sheriff Scott.
Good
I-
evening, Mayor.
I'd like to turn it over to Madam CEO to just introduce this next item. Then we'll go to you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So for several months now, our Financial Services Department has been reviewing and going over our procurement policies. As you will see in the report, we have taken a large list of policies and brought it down to 2 or 3 core policies. Through this process, we have taken a look at what other municipalities have had with respect to limits and authorities. And we also, because it was a fairly significant undertaking, we decided to engage the services of BLG to help us with those policies as well. So this evening, the intention is to, I think, run through the policies with council, because there are quite a few changes. And then the policies will come back for adoption and future meeting. So with that, I'm gonna hand it over to Mr. Sheriff Scott.
Thank you. Do you want to say something, or I can launch right in?
Yes, launch right in.
Okay.
The CAO has an intro.
Okay. Good evening, Your Worship and members of council. So my purpose here today is to give you a high-level overview of the policy that's been developed with your staff and input of your external legal advisor. I've tried to keep it at a high level. I understand that you'll probably have the textual version of the complete policy, which you could read at your leisure. Perhaps nighttime reading might assist you get to sleep, but so it's not the most riveting subject, but I'll try and get through it. And we've focused on a number of items that we anticipate may address some questions. I don't know if you've been given a textual version of the PowerPoint that is up here on the screen. If you have, that's great. You can follow along, or if not, the screen is up there, and I'm going to be sort of following it in terms of bullets. I'm not going to read it to you, but I'll just use it as a touchstone to make some points. So if we can just move to the first screen. We have someone that's pushing the buttons for us. I don't have a
Thank you, Ms.
control.
Cascadet.
The first textual screen. There we go. So we were asked and engaged to help you develop a policy, and the question is, why do you need a policy now? Why does it need to be updated? And the most simple answer is that effective July 2017, the Government of Canada executed 2 major trade agreements: the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which replaced the Internal Agreement on Trade, which regulates trade as between provinces, and the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with the EU, which regulates trade with foreign entities inside Canada. The difference between what came before and what exists now is these treaties now bind all sub-federal entities, including municipalities. That was not the case before. There was debate on that. Our view was that they never bound municipalities. Some municipalities elected to have them binding or to adopt some principles, but they are now legally binding on you in the execution of all procurement. Cornwall, like many municipalities, not only in Ontario and across the country, are updating their policies to remain in step with these legal imperatives, which are now binding on you, because you will find as many municipalities have, that failure to do so is often discovered at the other end of litigation, which is unfortunate. So the purpose of this developed policy is not only to keep in step with the trade agreements as they have been articulated and adopted and now bind you, but also to provide guidance and clarity to staff, to provide clear division of authority in terms of purchasing and spending powers for staff, and to delineate responsibilities clearly for the purposes of the municipality. It's all, and you know, the basic sort of motherhood statements as to why a policy is necessary are true, and they're listed there. I don't need to read them to you. But the major issue is compliance with trade agreements. If we could just go to the next slide. This policy, like the trade agreements, applies very, very broadly to the purchase of virtually any good or service, and those are defined there. I don't need to read them for you. You can see that the descriptor is extremely broad in its encompass and scope, and that's intended by the trade agreements to capture any purchase of things, whether service-related or goods, by any entity like municipalities, to ensure that the imperatives in the trade agreements are respected. And the primary imperative of these trade agreements is to ensure open, competitive procurement. Although there are exceptions and exemptions which we'll cover, that is the primary directive, the prime directive, as it were, and that's why these definitions are so broad. Just flip forward to the next screen. These are captured in your policy, and the sections of your policy are identified. So there are exemptions not only to your policy, but to the imperative for competitive procurement, and they're listed here. There are a couple examples. For example, when the municipality grants loans or gives equity infusions, public employment contracts, acquisitions of land or real estate, financial services, health services, legal services, expert witnesses, etc. There are a number of enumerated exemptions that your policy doesn't apply to. That doesn't mean you don't have a policy in respect of these items. That just means that the competitive imperative for open competition doesn't apply to these items. So this is clarifying what you are not required to take into account in terms of what is covered by the imperatives and the trade agreements. There are a whole list of these things, and I've set them out exhaustively here on the slides. They're in the slides that you have, and they're exhaustively listed in the policy for clarity, not only for your internal purposes, but to protect you against spurious claims by contractors. The next slide, which is, we can just flip forward to purchasing service responsibilities. What we've tried to do in terms of this policy is to clearly delineate by an effective org chart and identify, likewise, defined staff responsibilities and authority for purchasing. You'll see that your purchasing services department now has overall total supervisory responsibility for procurement at all levels. The procurement or purchasing supervisor provides those services at an executive and detailed level, and those are enumerated, for example, approving and prescribing procurement procedures, coordinating solicitations, and so forth, whereas the line management, division managers and supervisors act more in a delegated capacity to fulfill the directives of the supervisor. It's important for an employment perspective. It's important for efficient purchasing to regularize these definitions. These are new developments, and staff was at pains to clarify these issues because of internal complexities, which we hope these definitional imperatives will resolve. The next slide. We've taken pains to identify your financial authorities, in particular in circumstances where there's an issue on budget. All your expenditures under policy must be within the current council-approved annual budget, or if the budget has not been approved, not more than 50% greater than the previous year's budget. There are all kinds of exceptions to this rule. They are not extensive, but they are born out of necessity. So if approved estimates are not in, or there are urgent need for procurement, or there are circumstances that arise where purchasing has to happen in the normal course or by legal imperative, then your line staff are empowered to purchase, but only up to certain limits, ultimately with council approval if there's any real financial expenditure at issue that is not subject to approved estimates. So we've taken pains to ensure that there's no rogue purchasing outside of the approved estimate process, and that staff are constrained in their acquisitions to those matters identified in terms of limits within the policy. The process integrity issue is dealt with exhaustively because this is a major development in the trade agreements. The trade agreements basically set the minimum mandatory behavioral sort of imperatives in purchasing conduct by municipalities and those that are institutions purchasing. There are a number of these things. Some of them will not be welcome to smaller communities, such as Cornwall. For example, local preferences are forbidden by the trade agreements, and you are bound by that requirement. I'm the bearer of that tiding, and in municipalities this size or smaller, that is usually unwelcome. There's always a concern about favoring local bidders, but that's not now permitted at law, and it's easily set aside by bid challenge, which I routinely see in other forums. So these imperatives, like full disclosure of the evaluation criteria, not giving awards to non-compliant bidders, and ensuring the proprietary information is protected, and not giving local preferences, and a number of other enumerated rules which are all set in your policy, are really a reflection of the now mandatory imperatives in the trade agreement. There are a number of other points like confidentiality of information, personal purchases being prohibited, and the use of in-house bids by the municipality are all set out in your policy. In-house bids is an interesting matter that we've placed in your policy to cover circumstances where you will maximize efficiencies by interdepartmental bidding on with the private sector. So one of your departments may choose to bid against a private sector bidder, and the internal efficiencies can be taken in account if necessary or where warranted. We've also developed, as many municipalities have, a green preference requirement, which is in your policy. And by the way, your policy will be reflected in your procurement purchasing documents as being incorporated by reference. So all these imperatives will be adopted in effect, incorporated by reference, and they will bind purchasers or sellers to the city. And so these rules and regulations will protect you in terms of the play out of procurement with third-party providers. But the green environmental responsibility imperative is to provide a mechanism for evaluating bids where warranted to ensure environmental efficiency and protection of the environment. Timelines is always an issue of contention in litigation with suppliers. The timelines are very strictly regulated by the trade agreements and by other judicial developments, and we've set out all of the applicable timelines for procurements here. There's really no need to go through them exhaustively. The major imperative is 40 days, but then it can wind its way down to 10 days in certain circumstances, like exigent circumstances, or when there's an electronic process, the electronic receipt of bids. All of these things can reduce the time necessary for the city to purchase. This is always an issue for staff, especially when there's urgency to purchasing. When you have to have a 40-day period, it can be quite onerous to leave your procurement out before bids close. So this is a process that we've developed under the policy consistent with the trade agreements to identify and provide that flexibility in the city's toolkit. The next slide deals with the competitive procurement process, and just so you know, it's not necessary to state in your policy because these thresholds change all the time. The major imperative in the trade agreements for purchasing is that you have to have an open competitive procurement for goods over $100,000, for services over $100,000, and where you're purchasing construction of $252,000. So anything under that, each of those thresholds, need not be by an open competitive process if you so elect, but anything over those thresholds must by law now be consistent with the competitive procurement imperative, unless there's an exemption or exception, which is all set out in your policy. So starting with that as the introduction for this slide, what we've done here is we've identified who has responsibility for purchasing at certain levels and what instruments they may use in terms of their authority to carry out that procurement. And this is when a competitive procurement model is selected, whether it's below or above the thresholds. Sometimes it's worthwhile using when it's below the threshold, sometimes it's more efficient to use it for higher value items. But this is all carefully set out to make sure that each person in the staff matrix knows who does what, how much they can spend, and what instrument of procurement they are to use. There are a variety of instruments: requests for quotations, requests for proposals, requests for tenders. They all very different mechanisms contractually that serve different interests. Likewise, we've developed, as you'll see in the next slide, sorry, back one, the procurement model and staff division of responsibility, as well as the instrument of purchase for non-competitive procurements. These would be those that are below the thresholds or that apply to exempted or accepted procurements. And so these instruments and these people for these thresholds can carry out these procurements in accordance with your policies. The next thing the policy does is identify a number of purchasing instruments and vehicles. We have a request for information, which is not a purchase. It's usually used to prospect information to develop a major RFP. You're seeking information from suppliers on major technical issues. We have requests for expression of interest. And then the next vehicle is a new development, which is a purchasing credit card. This has been developed in consultation with your staff. It is for low-end purchasing. It is, the policy is exhaustive and definitional and detailed in terms of restricting the ability of staff to use these cards, who gets them, what the authority is, what they can and cannot do, accountability provisions, discipline provisions are all there. But this is meant to optimize efficiency as well as to ensure accountability, transparency, and potential discipline where warranted. You'll see the next slide. Request for a quotation. The usual imperative is that you get 3 when it's open and competitive, and the responsibilities for RFQs are identified in the policy. And the next 2 slides, the request for tender and request for proposals, are similar. Request for tender is typically used when you have known goods or services that you're acquiring. And one of the major developments that we've recommended that you adopt is not to formally open your bids in public. We've found over the years, and it's my personal experience, having litigated hundreds of these cases, that this process of opening bids is antiquated in public, and it is rife with potential for litigation and confusion. We have developed with your staff far more flexible instruments of procurement which allow the correction of irregularities, of errors, of price negotiation, of different vehicles of procurement, which give the city a whole lot more flexibility in its toolkit. There has developed over the last 30 or 40 years very rigid, straitjacketed rules for procurement, which have produced massive amounts of litigation that have been a burden on institutions purchasing. And our process of consultation with your staff has been designed to try and allow you to have far more flexibility in your toolkit to avoid these straitjackets, to allow corrections, to allow negotiation and flexible adaptive procurements in your interest, while at the same time insulating you from litigation. And so removing the public opening of bids, while you may hear complaints about that from contractors, I'm telling you as your lawyer, it is a terrible idea to do that, and many municipalities and others have adopted the same process. So that doesn't mean that the results are not announced. They are announced after internal evaluations are conducted.
Excuse me.
Yep.
Councillor Grant?
So basically, the purchasing department will open the bids? Is that what I'm hearing here? Rather than us, we used to come and open them in the council chambers. So basically, the purchasing department will open these, and they will then award the whoever is the lowest bidder based on all the criteria. Is that correct?
Well, it's sort of correct through you. The process is that bids are received if it's a request for proposals. An RFP is used as a solution where you don't have a defined good or service. So I want a solution and a price. So what happens, often there's a 2-stage process or a 2-envelope process. The purchasing staff with an evaluation team will receive the bid, open the bids to ensure conformance with all of the mandatory requirements There may be form requirements, there may be detail requirements, there may be insurance requirements, there may be bonding requirements. So the first section of the evaluation is, does this meet all of the minimum mandatory criteria? Once that is off the table, then the bid is subjected to an evaluation for mandatory conformance or evaluation criteria by an evaluation team. That evaluation team is typically has expertise in reviewing bids. They evaluate the bid for conformance. They'll often score it. And if it's scored, that matrix of scoring will then be set aside, and ultimately then price will be opened. In the old-fashioned world, in construction in particular, everybody got a bid. It was, you know, the whole sort of city piled into the chamber and bids are all open. They read out the numbers. And it just produced massive confusion. It constantly produces litigation because people will say, well, that bid wasn't compliant, this bid was compliant. And so purchasing is now changed, and we're moving away from these old rules because we found, as a result of litigation inadvertently induced by case law, that institutions, because of these common law straitjackets, are being sued constantly for things, among other reasons, like opening bids in public, which just produce confusion and finger pointing. So it's not taking anything away from council in terms of authority. It's vesting in staff the responsibility to conduct proper evaluations.
It doesn't bother me because I thought it was a ridiculous process anyway.
Yeah,
So,
I agree with you.
okay, thank you.
Okay.
Are there any other questions on that? Councillor McIntosh?
Yeah, David, when you talk about purchasing department opening the bids, would there have to be more than one person in that room?
Well, typically, through you, Madam Chair, that
Big committee?
typically what happens is there's an evaluation committee selected in advance, and sometimes if it's a really big bid, there's a fairness monitor that the municipality hires to ensure process conformance. So the committee receives it as a group, and in a two-envelope system where you have a technical proposal which is scored for compliance with technical criteria, they'll review that and assess it, and then they'll once the bidders that are selected, perhaps the top three are scored, you go on to price, and then price will be dispositive. But that team of people who have expertise are the ones opening the bid, they're evaluating. They do that in private, and then they'll announce the scores eventually, but they don't do this sort of open
That's
free-for-all
required,
process.
though. That's required to have a group. Like, there can't be a case where one person sits down with his buddy and goes through it. There has to be a group.
In major
Team effort,
purchases, yeah, you'll see in the purchasing policy how these things are conducted. There is discussion of the evaluation process, and the responsibilities for how they are conducted are all set out in the policy in terms of the delegation of, and identification of who does what.
Get you.
Okay. An RFQ, which is the next slide, this is really a prospecting exercise that we advise you to have in your toolkit, because often municipalities, hospitals, school boards try and identify a list of expert suppliers. So you may want to have a roster of expert or well-known electricians or certain construction contractors or certain engineers. And what you do is you'll do a pre-qualification assessment. It will be a public process, and there'll be criteria that are announced. A certain number of scores will be identified. A list, which is shortlisted, will be identified. You may have 5 bidders. And then what you're required by the trade agreements to do, if you have a further procurement, is you go to that list of 5 expert bidders, and you get prices from each of them. The purpose of this is to weed out the garbage suppliers, because there are often many in many sectors, and when you dance with them, you always dance straight into court. So this is designed to allow the city the flexibility to identify the best suppliers and then work with them. But the trade agreements require you to do a refresh on your list every single year, so you can't shut people out indefinitely. There's a constant refresh process. So that's all set out in the policy. These are sort of same sort of shades of the same coin. There are information gathering processes and negotiation facilities and flexible tools that we've identified in the policy. We don't need to go through them in any detail. The next slide, we talk about two-envelope process I've described for you. This is a common process in more complex procurement. We've provided for a resolution by way of tie. It might surprise you to know that there's often tied bids right down to the cent. Whether those are collusive or not, I can't say, but often there are tied bids, and frequently procurement instruments have no mechanism to resolve them, and then there's litigation. So we've provided for mechanisms for tied bids for circumstances where bids exceed your budget, and that's what those sections of the procurement policy that we've drafted are designed to accomplish. Now, just like there are exemptions, there are permissible circumstances where you don't have to go to public open procurement. The major imperative, of course, underlying these trade agreements is that you should do that, but there are a whole raft of circumstances where you are permitted to depart from that imperative, and they're all listed here. And usually they're defined circumstances. You're not allowed to go outside of these exemptions or non-competitive procurement exceptions, but they are actually fairly flexible and typically serve municipalities where the circumstances warranted. And those are just really a reflection of what the legal imperatives are. The next slide, I put this in here because I understood that one of the councillors may have had a question about the disposal of surplus goods. It is addressed in your policy. How this is to be done is now set out in detail. No person in the municipality or staff can benefit through this. It has to be a specific gradated process. You have to start with the identification of the surplus. It'll then be treated as a trade-in against procurement of similar goods. So if you're trading in your car, you get a credit. Or otherwise sold by external advertisement, auction, or tender. Failing that, donation to a nonprofit or charitable, and then lastly, classifying as waste. And all this money goes back into the reserve account used to fund replacement of goods, so that there's not going to be any complaints about how this stuff is handled.
Councillor Hubert?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Just a question. I understand that there's, the order of things, trade-in, then be sold, then donation. If there was something that council thought maybe we should go directly to donation, if there was a need in the community, do we have the authority to play around in that order, and before putting it out for auction or tender, going ahead and making that donation to a charity?
The way it's set up is that council, that the money should go back to the reserve account to fund replacement for those purposes. The thing can be tweaked if that's the will of council, but right now it's structured in terms of priorities.
Understood.
Okay, now the next slide deals with supplier conduct, and this is sort of toward the end of the policy, and supplier conduct will dovetail the discipline policy for suppliers. I find in my experience in procurement litigation that supplier conduct questions come up constantly. Can we take it into account? Can we take their past conduct into account? How can we get rid of this terrible bidder? That, what are we going to do now that they're bidding and oh no, they're the lowest price. Do we have to give this horrible bidder the contract? This is a constant question I field for municipalities, for hospitals, for major institutions. And typically what happens is, because their procurements are not built to address this, they're left with the reality that they have to confront these people and do business with them again and again. So what we have done is we've tried to develop a number of imperatives here to deal with supplier conduct and to allow staff to consider in the evaluation of any procurement, past history, all of the evidence that comes to staff's attention. But as you'll see from the discipline policy that follows this, this does place a burden on staff, because there's now going to be a record-keeping requirement. There's going to be a requirement to keep forensic information and history on various contractors, particularly bad ones, and there's going to be a need to record keep. But hopefully that will be in your interests, and this kind of supplier conduct set of rules and requirements are being increasingly adopted by municipalities and major purchasers to deal with rogue vendors and vendors who are difficult historically. So we thought this was warranted, and it should be in the toolkit of your staff. There are a whole lot of developed issues on this that you can read it at your leisure. or not, but basically what we've tried to do is to make sure that your policy is consistent with others and as well as our own unique perspective on these issues from a litigation vantage to protect the city. On resolution of conduct, conflict, this is in the event where there are disputes. We've set out a preliminary process for the resolution of disputes, which is again consistent with the trade agreement and comparatives, which require there to be some form of dispute resolution process. It doesn't have to be arbitration. We've also built into your policy, which will be incorporated into all your purchasing interests or instruments, deemed releases of liability, which are very extensive, and there is litigation currently on that before the Supreme Court of Canada, which has been approved. These releases have been approved in policies by various courts of appeal, and so they're in your policy now to try and insulate and protect you. And those are in tandem with dispute resolution provisions, which limit the claims of bidders to their bidding costs and preparation costs and tries to shut down large damage awards against the municipality. The last slide on your policy is called irregularities, and what we've done here is the traditional mindset in purchasing has been this straitjacket where if there's any error in a bid, it's out, even though they may be the best value, the best bidder, and the best price. So we've tried to define these irregularities consistent with legal jurisprudence and developments, as well as to provide adaptive flexibility to staff to resolve not only major irregularities and errors, but minor ones. The typical legal common law rule is you can only fix a minor irregularity in a bid, but where warranted, we've provided for staff with the mechanism to correct major irregularities where that's necessary or they consider it to be appropriate. So, for example, if there's a simple error in a bid and it's a major issue, and there's no reason to suspect it's not just a plain error, the question is often asked, well, why wouldn't you allow them to fix it? As long as it's fair and transparent and consistent and provided for in the instrument, it can be accomplished. It's where it's not addressed either in your policy or your purchasing documents that it produces litigation. And so we've tried to structure that and address it.
Councillor Hollingsworth has a question.
Quick question.
Yeah.
So let me give you a scenario. You can tell me if this makes sense, because it happened X number of years ago. Two bidders, bidder one inadvertently puts a decimal in the wrong spot, even though had the decimal been placed in the right spot, the municipality would have saved something in the range of 30 grand or something to that nature. But clearly the decimal's in the wrong spot, even though everyone knows like he's made this mistake. Does that mean that now we can say, well, obviously he screwed this up, because there's no way he would have made that mistake, and then that gives kind of our administration or whomever is in charge to say, yeah, we don't think that was a mistake, this guy gets the bid. Can we do that?
So the answer is yes and potentially no, but the overall answer is yes. You will be able to do that in appropriate circumstances where your purchasing instrument identifies that authority. So we've provided for that authority.
Okay.
You won't be surprised to know that there are probably 5,000 cases just like that, where their line item or their unit pricing items, and they multiply it by the wrong unit, or it's clear, and if you line up all the prices, you see the price makes sense, but the number of units doesn't. It goes on and on and
Yeah,
on.
it was a unit price issue where the decimal, instead of 96 cents, it was a $9.60 or something.
Yeah. Some include the wrong number of units, and when they do the multiple, they get the right price. And so the staff will say, but you don't have the right number of units, but you've got the right price, and vice versa. You get all of these administrative mistakes. And so we've given staff the flexibility to correct minor irregularities, as well as major ones where warranted in their discretion, depending on the procurement instrument. Because the basic rule is, if you don't address it in your purchasing policy or your instrument, then you leave it to the court to decide what is material or what is not material. And then you're into litigation. And then you're into spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on court fees and rolling the dice, depending on your...
For a $20,000 tender.
Well, usually for bigger ones, but you never really want to roll the dice where you don't have to. So this gives staff good discretion in terms of addressing
Councillor
these
Gardner
issues.
has a question.
When he's finished.
Not now?
No,
Okay.
when he's finished.
And then, just so the segue into this was my last comment. This is a supplier discipline policy, and this is meant, it's very short, and probably exhausting your patience, but let me just give you the high-level overview without having to go into the individual slides. What this policy is designed to do is to allow the city to exclude people, to create a master list of exclusions for the bad bidders that are constantly and chronically engaged in litigation with you, who behave badly, who are convicted of criminal offenses, who have engaged in bid rigging, collusion, or other inappropriate conduct, who routinely do not conform with the essential requirements of their work and so forth. It's not like there are a host of these people, but there are always a group of them, and they provide a constant thorn in every purchasing institution's side. So this policy is designed to allow staff to keep records, to identify who these bidders are, and to publish, in effect, an exclusion. Now, because you're excluding them from the possibility of economic benefits, you have to give them administrative law fairness. So you're going to have to tell them why and give them an opportunity to respond, and then you make your decision. And as long as you do it in accordance with a decent policy and procedure, you're allowed to do it. And this policy sort of exhaustively sets out who can do what the information you require is, what the grounds for this are, how long the suspensions can be. Obviously, for criminal and collusive activities, these suspensions are higher, up to 5 years. For minor transgressions, they can be 1 year or between 1 and 5 in the discretion of staff. There are provisions for reinstatement and so forth. It's all here, and many municipalities are now moving to adopt the Supplier Code of Conduct because it's helpful to, it's really designed to protect you as a purchasing institution from the rogue and difficult bidder. That's really what this policy is all about, and you know, all the authority levels of each individual staff and how this comes about, the process, and the administrative law fairness provisions are all set out in the policy in detail. And that's the high-level overview.
We have further questions for you.
Sure.
Let's start with Councillor Gardner and then Councillor Grant.
Thank you for the report. When I was reading the agenda, I think you might have covered it, but I didn't quite understand it. Unbalanced bid. What exactly does that mean? I read it and I know what you're saying here, but can we reject it? Can we ban it? Ban that company?
What the policy provides is that procurement instruments can include terms that reject unbalanced bids. And if there's habitual unbalanced bids, then those suppliers can be punished by being placed on a list. An unbalanced bid is one which is, you see this, typically you see the unbalanced bid scenario in construction contracts. And the contractor will put in an incredibly low bid, and then you will be extra'd to death with, you know, extra and extra and extra and change order and extra, and this wasn't contemplated and that wasn't contemplated, and you get into a constant sort of stream of dealing with these issues, and that usually happens in the unbalanced bid scenario where they're so profoundly low it looks like they're treating it as a lost leader to try and get the job, but they're not. They're very skilled at negotiating, they're very skilled with extras, and they tend to do this, and these are contractors to be avoided. And unfortunately, you know, it's not an uncommon occurrence in the industry. It's not just construction, I'm not pointing any fingers, there are many contractors that do this kind of thing, and because it's a very habitual and common experience, the unbalanced bid scenario is addressed in your policy.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Grant and then Councillor McIntosh.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. It's the city's responsibility to ensure that the supplier discipline policy is, they're well aware of it, that we have to be proactive.
Well, Madam Chair, through you to the councillor, the policy will be published online, and it will be referred to in your procurement instruments, and so they will have notice of it.
Good. Thank you.
Councillor McIntosh, then Councillor Adai.
Two questions on shutting out people. What if you made it public that this person can no longer, you can't do that, can you? What would be the ramifications of making a public statement or?
Well, Madam Chair, through you to the councillor, you know, that would be something you would do on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't want to, you may have an internal list, but publishing a list and reasons for it would just be invidious. You'd just invite a defamation lawsuit. It's just not something you'd want to do.
Yeah. Also, in a small city like this,
Yeah.
sometimes we don't get 2, 3, 4 bidders. Putting somebody on that list, could that come back and haunt you because it eliminates one more bidder?
It could. There is provision for reinstatement.
Mhm.
You know, this is usually for fairly egregious conduct. You're not going to be placed on this list unless you've really caused some grief. And most of the suspension would be no longer than a period of 1 year. The 5-year scenario is for, you know, fraud and criminal conviction and collusion and bid rigging and something that fundamentally undermines the integrity of the process and is contrary to the public interest as opposed to more minor infractions.
Councillor Evad and then Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I guess I'll stay. I'd like to bring light to something that's really great in here. Item 4.10, the environmentally responsible green procurement, something that I've mentioned before. I'm glad that it's here, and I know that we are forbidden from adding a local purchasing component, but I've said it before, where this kind of item can certainly help us prefer local bidders, as we would hopefully within the tendering or the RFP process be calculating the environmental impact. And so if we're shipping goods from across the province or across, you know, the country versus buying locally, we're going to be weighing that environmental impact along with price, et cetera, et cetera. So my question, so it does say that we may use this as a way to grade, I suppose, the tenders and the RFPs. I'm wondering, how are we weighing it, and like, what is the weight? Is that something that you've worked on in this policy, or is that something the staff that are going to decide with a case by case? So maybe that's a question for Ms. Bailey.
I can answer that.
Okay, great,
yeah.
thank you.
Madam Mayor, through you to the councillor, the individual evaluation process will be dependent on the procurement instrument in each case. So
Okay.
if you're actually purchasing, you know, waste services and there's a recycling component, then there's going to be a major green component. If you're purchasing, you know, widgets, there may not be. You do have to be careful in terms of the use of this imperative, because if you start sort of calculating, well, how far is the contractor transporting his Chesterfields to Cornwall, and therefore they're consuming too much gas and polluting the world, you may find yourself, you know, in an area that's not as intended by what this is contemplating than not. So you can't stretch it really far. It's designed to encourage the promotion of green services and allows you to use in the evaluation process in any discrete instrument set of evaluation criteria that favors those factors.
So I know that in the process, there is a weight for each criteria. Let's say there's 10 criteria on it in a tender process. And this is going to, I hope, be in all of these new, going forward, all the processes. I'm wondering what the weight is. You know, is it, and I'm sure it's going to be different, but if we're weighing it against cost, is this going to be like 5% of the evaluation, or will it be, you know, more like 20? How much weight are we actually giving to this? Or is it, we're just putting it in there to say we've done it and give it 4%, and it really never ever makes an impact when we are going through the process? I just
No.
want to make sure that it actually is significant.
Yeah, no, I
And
think
not
it's
just
significant. It allows you the flexibility to use this as an evaluation tool. And it's more than a sort of platitudinous statement. it allows you to, in specific instances, to apply criteria to give as much weight as you want on any given procurement to environmental factors. Some procurements will have little, if nothing, to do with those issues.
Of course.
Others will be much more important, and so staff will decide in consultation with internally as well as stakeholders how the procurement instrument is developed and what weight is to be allocated. You can't predetermine the weight that would be allocated to this factor before you choose your instrument and what you're purchasing, but it's designed to be an important foundation for using this as a policy device to encourage a green solution.
So we're looking at this case by case. Every time an RFP is created, we're going to see what weight we can add to it to make it fair.
Exactly.
Correct? Okay, great, thank you.
Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you for your presentation. It's actually nice seeing an open council meeting as opposed to the alternate. Usually that's not as pleasant for us. Appreciate the amount of work that's gone into this. This is something that we've talked about for, I think, since last term now. I have a comment or two, and then I have some questions as well. In regards to the authority levels in purchasing, I have to say, maybe I'm a little old school, but in my opinion, this is just how I feel. When something's not budgeted, I do feel it should come to council regardless of the amount. I realize we can say that it's wasting time and whatnot, but the reality is setting the budget is part of our responsibility as a council, so when we pass that on, it's not that I don't trust those individuals, it's more just, it's something I feel we should have better control over. So, and I noticed that other municipalities, the policy varies. There is not a municipality on this chart that gives any approval to the CFO, but there are some that do give it to the CAO. But all the same, I feel that should come to council, like our colleagues in Brockville and South Glengarry. Moving away from that, however, I was glad that you touched on buy local and how that's not really permissible outright in the policy. That's something that we've also spoken about here, but it's certainly come up in meetings we can't discuss. So it's nice to finally have that discussion in a public forum. I did have a question, though. You may have touched on this, but when we use when we put out a tender and there's a grading system involved, we don't receive those numbers back in terms of the grading. We're just told that the company in question met all the criteria for it, and this is something that's come up before. Now, I'm almost certain in the past, but I can't find it. I've seen an article from a municipality up north where they did actually release those grading numbers, where they made them public. Mm-hmm. That's something we've talked about doing here, but it's come up that it might actually be detrimental to the company's bidding because it could be seen as slander. That being said, I think we've all seen what happened in Ottawa recently, where it turns out the company that was recommended and got the bid didn't even meet the threshold. So, looking for an opinion on including those numbers in the reports back to council. What's your opinion on that?
Madam Mayor, my response is that this is a question for council to decide, and the evaluation process is designed to be internal. Whether that's internal to council and staff is one thing. It's not designed to be public. For the public consumption of all the internal information. There are restrictions on confidentiality that protect bidders' information that they supply for their competitive process and business interests that they don't want to be disclosed. But there's no reason that the details of the evaluation can't be shared with council as long as council understands that those are confidential numbers. And the non-budgeted expenditure item is really designed for efficiency, and if you look at the numbers, not that I'm saying 20,000 isn't a lot of money, but in a municipality of this size, it's not a lot of money. And so it's designed really for efficiency, and the circumstances where non-budgeted expenditures can be made are enumerated and limited to very precise issues. I take your point about Ottawa. There's nothing really in here that prohibits the disclosure of details of evaluations to council, especially on larger procurements. Council may want those kinds of reports, and typically there would be a report just by staff. Certainly on major awards, you're giving your staff the authority to make these awards. but council can always give direction if it sees fit. The sensitivity here is that what often happens, or what can happen, not here necessarily or anywhere specifically, but what can happen anywhere, is that there's, especially in municipalities, there's a tension between the staff purchasing and political interference with it. And so there's a delicate balance to be struck by these policies to clothe your staff with necessary and efficient authority to carry out their function without what I'll describe without any value judgment as potentially unwarranted intervention on a political side, and you may have seen that. And so you have to try and walk a delicate balance, which gives staff the respect it deserves, as well as giving council the authority that it implicitly has. So we've tried to strike that balance in your policy and give your staff the authority it needs to do efficient purchasing. I think there's adequate accountability in your policy because all of these things are defined, their roles are delineated and very carefully circumscribed in terms of the limits of their authority. So that's why we're at pains to describe the functions of staff as well as their responsibilities, who does what and so forth, because accountability is important to council, obviously.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor, one more question. You may recall this came up, but just a hypothetical for you. So, say council, we're at a meeting like we are tonight, and I'm sure there's tenders later on. I know there's tenders later on. But it comes up for vote. Under this new policy, is council able to just vote against the tender? Or do we need, like, it's something that's happened before, but are we able to do that? Are we protected in that regard? Because it has been an issue in the past. Is that even allowable? Can we just outright vote against the tender if we decide we don't want it?
Probably not. Under the trade agreements, there are the basis for refusal by an institution like a municipal council. You have to reject a valid tender that conforms with the essential criteria of the tendering instrument. You would have to decide as a council that it was against public policy to award that contract. And that is a very probably difficult argument to make. And this isn't me telling you what you can't do. This is what's in the trade agreements. The trade agreements have basically say this: if you issue a procurement instrument and all the essential criteria are met, then you've got to give that award. That's the essential requirement. And unless council then decides, not in its unfettered discretion, because it no longer has that unfettered discretion, that it's against the public interest for good and valid reasons, then and only then would you be able to vote it down. Okay. And I'm telling you, what will happen is, what happens and what has happened and what will happen is when municipalities do that and they don't have the adequate reasons to support the public interest foundation for their decision, they will be sued.
Great. Thank you very much. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me just follow up before I go to Councillor Bennett on Councillor Towndale's comment. But individual councillors on a tender might vote against it for whatever personal reasons they have. The issue becomes when a majority of councillors then vote down the tender. Is that correct?
What I'm suggesting, Madam Mayor, is that your staff have the authority to issue a procurement instrument as given to them by your policy and as delegated authority. And under these trade agreements, when they do that, you're not allowed to vote it down unless you have a public policy exemption.
Right. But an individual councillor who wanted to vote against a tender, as has been done regularly around the table,
Sure.
does not have necessarily an impact other than to satisfy that personal councillor that they voted against it.
Yeah, I can't count for the way people will vote. They might abstain or something like that, but
Right.
council can't intervene unless there's this public interest found. In the old procurement instrument, we have a clause called a privilege clause, which gives reserved rights to the purchaser to cancel for a variety of reasons. And it used to be, it's a much litigated clause. but the trade agreements are moving away from these reserved rights of institutions in purchasing to promote open competition. And so they've said, unless you have a solid public policy rationale, you can't vote it down. You can't renege on the deal that you've put out in public when a bidder conforms with the essential criteria of your bid and is selected as the winner.
Thank you.
Okay.
Councillor Bennett?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Kind of following on the points Councillor Towndale just made, I have a bit of a problem with the way RFPs are done, and for that reason. So if we say we need whatever, the administration does all the work to write an RFP, we send it out, we get all the bids back, we pick a nice winner, and we have a problem with it because we don't have an opportunity to say anything. We basically have to accept it no matter what we feel, because that's the law. We're stuck with that bid. So I'm wondering if it isn't possible that before an RFP goes out to tender, it comes to council to view. Maybe nobody has a problem with it, and it just, like, for instance, consent, general consent. We can approve the whole thing as one big motion. So if we came to council with 5 RFPs and nobody has a problem with it, then we say RFPs and we like them all, great. But if somebody has questions about an RFP, or maybe thinks that something should be added to it or taken out of it, that would be the time for council to have a say on what the RFP is going to look like, rather than it come back to council and we have to prove it the way it is because there's no opportunity to change it at this point. So I'm wondering does it make sense to have RFPs come to council before they're actually sent out?
Madam Mayor, that's something that can be done. Let me suggest that your municipality buys a lot of goods and services. Cornwall is some 60,000 people or more.
48.
48, sorry. 50,000. That means you're buying a lot of stuff, so you'd be looking at a lot of RFPs if that were the case. But so again, the tension is between what you want to give your staff authority to do and what you want to take up your time doing as a councillor. And we've tried to strike a balance in your policy, and I think that what you're talking about really is something that is for discussion with staff and the mayor on major procurements, and
Right.
As opposed to
Buying a box of paper from the office, I want to know.
Yeah. And really, your staff has the expertise in terms of developing procurements, and you may not always be happy with what comes out of the sausage grinder, but it's a difficult process. So there's nothing that strictly prevents that in your policy. And if you guys are purchasing a major item, I don't think there's anything that in here that prevents you from giving some direction to see what the structure of the purchase would be in advance of sending it out. I don't think that's inconsistent with the policy, but what we've tried to do is give staff appropriate authority here to conduct procurement in an efficient way, respecting council's authority as well.
I appreciate that. I think the RFP question comes up just recently because of the waste management one, where here it is, and pretty much just had to say yes. It was too late to have any opinion on it. So I thought maybe if we had seen it before it went out, then maybe somebody had questions about recycling, or somebody had questions about whatever, that would have been the time to address it, so that when the RFP went out, some of the concerns that the 11 of us may have had could maybe have been addressed, rather than now it's too late. Here's your tender that came back, and now you're stuck with it. So that was kind of where my thought was there.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Bergeron?
Hi.
Hi.
So I suppose the fundamental question I have, first of all, is why do we vote on RFPs? I'm a councillor, I'm elected, my vote matters. Why do I get to vote on an RFP if you're telling me that I have to vote in favor of it?
Good question. I don't think you do have to.
Thank you. I voted against an RFP, which Councillor Bennett just mentioned, because I did not feel it was in the best interest of the city. I agree that I think the process is broken. It gets to us at the wrong time. It seems to me like you're saying, when it comes to you, you must approve it. Am I missing something? Is there something I'm not understanding there?
No, the process is designed so that staff, in collaboration with council, develops documents, including procurements for major issues. It's not designed to exclude council, it's designed to respect council's authority and to give your staff necessary authority to purchase, unless the council wants to be the purchasing manager of services, in which case you'll be spending all your time writing procurement documents. It's, you know, there's, as I said before, there's a real tension between providing authority to your staff and the intervention of council. So if you give your staff delegated authority to conduct purchasing, that's what they do, and they do it in accordance with the legal requirements that are now sub-federal and bind this municipality like every municipality.
Right, I don't have much issue with that. I have issue with the fact that it comes to council and we're being told we must vote for it. Or we're breaking the law, essentially. By the time it gets to us, it's too late to discuss. And I'm wondering if there's a way around that. And Councillor Bennett suggested maybe bring it here first and then send it out to RFP. I have a real issue with an RFP coming to us where we have to vote for it. I respect the fact that I am an elected official and my vote matters. And when I get to vote, I read through the documents, but if you are telling me, oh, it's an RFP, you must vote for it, I will not stand for that. I will not just vote for it because I'm told that is the rule of law. If that's the case, it shouldn't come to council. It should just be law. So I think I'm missing something in between there. And Councillor Bennett, I think, was reaching at it. I don't know if your answer gave me the answer I was looking for.
I'm not saying you have to vote on an RFP. If you've given a delegated authority to your staff to conduct a purchasing through an instrument, they can do that. They don't need your vote.
Okay, thank you. That answers one question.
Okay.
But if it comes to this council and I vote against it, I say this is not in the best interest of the city of Cornwall.
Then you can take that position.
Well, I have taken that position. But am I breaking the law?
No. I'm just telling you that a court will review your decision if necessary at the instance of an aggrieved bidder. And if they don't consider that there was an adequate foundation for your vote, then they will overturn your decision. That's all.
That's exactly the answer I was looking for.
Okay.
And that means a lot, because it means we do get to vote against things. There's just a higher body that decides if we were correct or not, correct?
That's true, yes.
Okay, thank you.
That only becomes an issue, though, if 6 people are on this table, right?
Right.
So going back to the point I was making earlier. So, before I go to Councillor Hollingsworth, I'll just follow up on that. If we have no choice in how we as a council vote, what is there anything good about bringing this and keeping this on an agenda? Like, does it force some transparency, putting it on a public agenda? Do you know what I mean? I'm trying to reach for what possibly good reason we would have to put it on an agenda when we really understand from you that our hands are tied.
So, the councillors here make a good point, that if you have
Right.
a serious procurement, that's something that you may want to ventilate before council, before it gets issued, and then council can look at the RFP and kick it around and tear it to shreds and say, this is not right, we don't like this is right, this is wrong, and give appropriate direction. What I'm saying is that once the cat is out of the bag, you've delegated the authority and the staff is purchasing in accordance with its delegated responsibility. No, I don't think you don't have to pass a bylaw to say, yes, we're gonna award that contract. Your staff has the authority under this policy.
But would you recommend that we keep putting it on the agenda? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, I know what you mean. I don't think it's necessary.
Huh,
Fascinating.
okay. So, for transparency purposes, for public notice purposes, any
Those are-
use in that?
Those are different considerations that you'll have to consider in your discretion. They're not legal imperatives.
They're community imperatives.
Well, they are, sure, and I'm not suggesting they don't have value in that regard.
Right. Thank you for that. I'll go to Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just one quick question. I was always under the impression that a tender was kind of cut and dry. You get your tender, low bid gets the job. And so that one was, look, if this guy meets the criteria, we want you to have a truck and 2 workers, and they do that, and they do the bid, and they're the low bid, it's done. And so in essence, us voting on those is kind of bogus, in the sense that it's already cut and dried. If we did anything, we're gonna be in a courtroom. The one thing that I was always led to believe, and maybe I've got this wrong, is that an RFP was subject to interpretation, in the sense that you kind of have some wiggle room because you're doing the request for proposal, which means we're gonna kind of disseminate it as a council or as an administration. Am I getting it that if somebody does the request for proposal and it meets the criteria, we can't say, well, I know you did this, but, and you were awarded so many points by the committee, but we as a council, we don't necessarily see that as important as something else, so we don't have any RFPs? I've been doing this all wrong all these years.
No, I think you're onto something that's important. It depends on the purchasing instrument. So, you know, a request for a tender or a request for a quotation is up the alley of the first scenario you gave me. You
Yeah,
say, I
right.
want a quotation on 50 chairs that have velour covering that are 20 inches wide and 50 inches high, with casters and blah, blah, blah. And you say, here's my spec, this is what I want your price. That's cut and dry. If you want to design the architecture of a city building and you put out a request for proposals, then you have, potentially more flexibility on voting. It depends on the instrument. So you're not going to have flexibility voting on a request for tenders or a request for quotations, or when you're asking for a fixed price response to buying 500 widgets. You may have more flexibility on the response to a request for proposals.
Okay, that's all I need to know. Thank
Okay.
you.
Councillor Dupel?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I mean, I voted the same way as my colleague did on that last tender that we had, or last request for proposal. I think that maybe that, Councillor Bennett makes a really good statement here tonight, that maybe we need to, along with administration, come up with an amount of what the RFP would be, that we would see it before, prior to coming back and it being told that we have to support it. So I think there's a lot of merit to that, and I think that if by this policy being updated tonight, are we still in line to make a motion to that effect moving forward? If we wanted to see RFPs come after a certain amount of dollars, we wanted to see them come before council. So I don't think we would spend a lot more time, because there'd be no debate then when they actually would appear on the agenda if nobody had any issues with them. They would be kind of pre-approved.
So tonight, we're not going to be passing this policy, Councillor Dupel. We are having the debate now. It'll be back on an agenda, upcoming agenda.
So Madam Mayor, I think what I'm asking is, like, when we come to approve this,
Right.
could we still make a motion regarding the RFPs?
I'll look at either Madam Clerk or Madam CEO to respond.
So thank you, Madam Mayor. So my response to that would be, yes, I think we can get direction from council following the adoption of this policy. And we have been discussing it internally and reviewing it as well. So I think that, depending on maybe the number of years of the contract, the consolidated value of what the contract would be. Also, if there is potentially a different type of level of service or impact to the community. Right, so following that last one, I would like to tell council that I truly believe that there should be a report that comes to council saying this is what we would like to do with this upcoming RFP prior to getting it issued. Wouldn't want to do that in every scenario, because we do issue a lot of RFPs, and some of them are for consulting or smaller projects that I don't think need to go through that. But for something that might have a significant impact to the community, if it affects levels of service, or if it's a certain dollar amount, or maybe if it's a certain dollar amount in combination with multiple years, right? Because some of these service contracts do run for, 3 to 5 years. So I would say that, and I think that we could come back to council with a report to provide some alternatives for something like that. But I'd want it to I would recommend that it becomes the contracts that we have recognized over the years that I think council likes to have more input on. And I think we know what those contracts are.
And I think through you, Madam Mayor, it's not only for us as elected officials, but for it to be more transparent and accountable, but it's also to protect staff that are making those decisions and not having it endorsed by council. I think when it's endorsed by council, it's a reassurance to the staff that are making those decisions. So that's where I'm coming from. I think it's half a dozen of one and half a dozen of the other, and I think it just needs to come together, because I think seeing something prior to it actually being awarded, it makes sense to me. If I have a question, I can do that rather than stand here on my feet the night of a council meeting where it's on the agenda and there's nothing you can do. So you need to just vote yes or vote no. But if six of us vote no, then we're putting the city at risk.
Right.
So.
Right.
Thank you.
Any further discussion? I'd just like to come back to something Councillor Hébert was talking about, the green policies. Are there any progressive cities that we could look to for inspiration around some of that? I mean, this will be fairly new for us, and I understand Councillor Hébert's struggle around how are we going to be really proactive with this so that it's not just a platitude, but an actual policy that moves us forward, right? Anything that we could be looking at in terms of progressive communities and their green policies and how they apply those?
We'd have to look at that for you, Madam Mayor. Our focus was on creating the policy that provided for this. There are some innovative, municipalities, most of them outside of Canada, but some in Canada and mostly on the West Coast that have more progressive green policies than a lot of Ontario municipalities. So we can look at how they're using these tools to evaluate specifically and what kinds of procurement instruments they're applying them to and how they're developing their evaluation criteria. Usually what happens is they'll have it in their policy like you have it in yours, but they'll have a much more developed process and practice of using it in their purchasing instruments. And it is a newer development, and so some municipalities in certain areas will have a much more established practice of using it in the evaluation matrix, and we can certainly prospect that information for you.
I suspect that may be of interest. This council has shown willingness to be progressive around environmental issues, but we might need some more encadrement, assistance in how we move that forward. You are aware that we had a little bit of a struggle at the beginning of our term around our waste management contract, so some of the questions tonight were a result of that struggle. An RFP is not cut and dry, and so it puts all of us in a delicate situation.
Well, an RFP is a different instrument, and it is a solution as well as a price, and so there is more of a public interest component to it. Your waste management service situation was really an apples to apples comparison between two tenders, and the issue really was price. And so that puts you in a sort of a different straitjacket that you might otherwise have been. I'm not saying there's no discretion in council at all. It depends on the instrument, and on a bigger RFP where there are major public interest components, it may well be that council has a much more developed role. And that can be articulated in the purchasing document as well, where necessary on the direction of council.
Thank you. Before I thank you for your presentation, I'd like to see if Madam CFO has anything that she'd like to add.
Not this evening. I hope that.
Can you take the mic, Madam CFO? Yeah. Thank you.
Not a lot this evening, but I would like to hear from council over the next few days or so that we can work with BLG on any changes you are proposing for our policies so that we can take them to the September 9th meeting. And also to thank David and his team. It was a very big process to look at our 16 policies, bring them together, align them with the trade treaties, and move from there.
Thank you. So that's a reminder to council that you have the next few weeks to put forward any questions or comments, probably through the CFO or CAO, and then we can consult with Mr. Sheriff Scott on that moving forward. So, David, thank you for your cogent presentation. You're here because we don't want to be danced into court We just don't want that.
That's the plan.
That's the plan. So thank you for your presentation, and we appreciate you coming here. I know it was difficult to park. We had a big agenda tonight. So thank you for your patience as well, and we'll come back to you on some of our questions. I'd like to continue discussion around the green policies as well, so that'll be coming back.
Thank you very much.
Merci. So we'll need a motion to receive. Thank you, Madame CAO. Councillor Gardner, Councillor McIntosh, all in favor? Thank you. Safe travel, Mr. Sheriff Scott. Next item, Madam Clerk.
So we're going to move on to the consent items. Number 1, exemption from noise bylaw at 1505 Churchill Street. With a recommendation that council approve the request made by Marnie McKinney for an exemption to the noise bylaw for an event being held on Saturday, August 24th at 1505 Churchill Street from 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. Temporary street closure for Cornwall Lions Club bed race. Recommending that council approve a temporary closure of Pitt Street from 1st Street to 2nd Street in order to host the Cornwall Lions Club bed race on Saturday, September 14th from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. Item 4, Proclamation of Childhood Cancer Awareness Month. Recommended that A, council proclaim the month of September as Childhood Cancer Awareness Month in the City of Cornwall. B, approve the raising of the flag at 360 Pitt Street for the month of September. And C, encourage city departments, businesses, and residents to paint city gold during the month of September. Item 5, Cornwall Fire Services Annual Report, with the recommendation that council receive this report. Item 6, second quarter financial results. The action recommended is that council receive this second quarter financial results for the period ending June 30th, 2019. Item 7, PAC report number 1, recommending that council approve the amended draft plan of subdivision for the Bellwood Ridge subdivision and the conditions contained in Appendix A, subject to the satisfaction of administration as approved at the Planning Advisory and Hearing Committee meeting on July 29th and approved by resolution, and to approve resolution 2019-10. PAC report number 3, recommending that council approve the following request received. At 25 2nd Street East, parking and landscaping enhancement, and sonic amusement at 132 Montreal Road. Item 9, request for removal of part lot control from Falcon Home Construction on Lot 32 on registered plan 52M43 in the City of Cornwall, Belford Estates subdivision. Recommending that this part lot control be removed and that part lot control be reinstated on the semi-detached lots in the Belford Estate subdivision once the separate lots have been created by the appropriate procedure. Item 10, proposed Freedom Mobile Inc. telecommunication monopole. Recommended that council endorse resolution 2019-11 of support for the proposed Freedom Mobile Inc. monopole antenna facility located at Tollgate Road East, vacant part east, half lot 6, concession 2, and provide an accompanying letter of concurrence. Item 11, 5-year review of the 10-year housing and homelessness plan, part 2. Recommended that council receive this report as a follow-up to the July 8th presentation to council.
The motion to receive those council items, Councillor Elaine McDonald, seconded by Councillor Maurice DePel. Any discussion? Councillor Bergeron?
Thank you. I'm not really a big fan of receiving 12 things at once, but that is what we're doing here. I just wanted to point out in the homeless plan, which is item in the homeless plan, it's a 5-year homeless plan. We received a presentation at the last council meeting, but it has action items in it. It has items for this council to act on to implement a homeless plan. And we're passing it as a report, but in that report is a whole bunch of things for us to do. And I really want to see these items come back in new business or in motions for this council to start implementing. So I'm happy to receive these reports. I don't have an issue with the motion on the table. There are some items in there that are just kind of hidden in, hey, this report says let's do this, so let's do this. I really want to see them come back as items. I'm happy to make them as motions at a further council meeting, but I have not forgotten them in general. Thank you.
Councillor Bayo?
Just a point of procedure for Councillor Bergeron. You can pull any of these items out of consent.
Yeah, I know.
So if
Thank
there's
you.
anything you'd like to speak to,
No, not today.
okay. Just want to make sure.
Right, so let me speak to that just briefly. We did have this on an open agenda, and we did have a discussion around the plan. I too, Councillor Bergeron, feel very strongly about a lot of those items, particularly item number 4 in that report, which is around innovation and innovative solutions with the private sector around creating more affordable housing. So I too will not let this be forgotten. I don't think it was hidden in a consent item. I wouldn't use the word hidden, but
Fair enough.
I will say that it's on my radar as well, and I look forward to you or any other councillor making motions to certainly move forward all of these business items. Especially number 4, that's my favorite, but all of the items are worthy of attention. So thank you for that. Any further discussion on the consent items? All in favor? Carried. Thank you.
Moving on to unfinished business reports. Item 2, future amendment applications, official plan and fee structure. Recommended that council continue to review the amendment request on a case-by-case scenario, and that the fee for each potential amending applications request be set at $500.
Councillor Grant? You make that motion. Is there a seconder? Councillor Elaine McDonald. Any discussion, questions, debate on that? No? All in favor? Carried.
Next item is the council compensation for term 2018 to 2022. Recommended that A, council receive the report, and then we are looking to council to provide direction to administration on how it wishes to proceed with its compensation.
Councillor Elaine McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. With regard to Part B, I do have a motion that I would like to outline for you touching councillor compensation. But I have to beg your indulgence. My motion is long. The preamble is long. And I think it's justified because it's an extremely complex matter. And I think it's something that, as a council, we haven't dealt with fairly for 3 terms at least. So with your indulgence, I would like to, I've given everybody a copy of the motion. And even though councillor compensation is very broad in that it includes things like expense accounts, it includes things like benefits, and obviously it starts with base pay, I would like to exclude everything except base pay from the discussion. Now, I know that as a council, we have to confront the issue of our compensation at least once every 4 years, but I don't think that means we can't confront it many times during 4 years. So if we could restrict the discussion today just to base pay, then I hope somebody else will make another motion, maybe in the next meeting even, or soon, touching the issue of expenses and benefits, because in my conversation with various councillors, both those issues came up, and I think they're very important to people. But I think they would distract from the main issue, which I see as base pay, so that's why I'd like to restrict it.
So do you have a seconder for your motion?
I do. Oh,
Councillor Gardner seconds the motion? Okay, so go ahead and outline your motion.
So thank you. So the comments I want to make about our base pay are that our base pay is inadequate and it's flawed. And I think part of the root cause of that is the fact that we have entertained the notion that our pay is not a pay, but it's actually an honorarium. And I think that's most inappropriate. An honorarium in the documentation we got through AMO usually refers to something under $10,000. And secondly, it's kind of an archaic term which refers to a situation that you use when payment would not be appropriate. In fact, might even be prohibited. For example, if you wanted somebody to give a speech but you couldn't possibly afford their fee, you might give them an honorarium instead. It's like a token. And I would suggest that an honorarium doesn't fit our situation. I believe we work, and we work hard. And I think that that demands that we get a wage, not an honorarium. And I think in the working world, a wage is always devised with regard to the value of the work that's performed for that wage. And I would suggest that we do very valuable work. So, we're workers. Now, when it comes to setting salaries, I think we have always consistently been very fair with our employees in that we give direction to our HR manager every year, and we always look for information regarding the middle ground. We're not trying to be the top across the province, and we certainly don't want to be the bottom because we don't want our employees to be pulling out. We obviously have to maintain a competitive wage and a fair wage, and we do that. And that, in turn, affects the wage that our managers receive, because once again, we aim for a middle ground. And I think that's fair, and I think people expect and respect that. But when it comes to our own wage, we have not followed the same principles. We haven't tried to reach or maintain the middle. What we've done is we've always opted for the lowest possible increase or adjustment. And for the last 4 years, that's been 2%. So it's unfortunate that because of that, at the end of the many years that I've been in council working with the issue of compensation, I really appreciate the fact that administration, Ms. Bailey, sought information from our neighboring municipalities and from municipalities similarly sized to us. And I think you might be shocked to hear that our wage actually ranks 10 out of 12 of neighboring and comparably sized communities. Now, 10 out of 12 might be okay if we were the 10th smallest or largest city, but we're not. We're actually, in size, 4th out of 12 municipalities. And in terms of our budgets, we actually have the second largest budget, which argues that we have the greatest deal of complexity. There's only one municipality with a larger budget than we have. And so for us to be 4th largest, second biggest budget, which means second largest challenge to accept a pay rate or to address to councillors a pay rate of 10th out of 12 is grossly unfair. And I think that has to be remedied. So in order for us to remedy it, though, we can't just say others are making more than we are. I think we have to base it on these very valid reasons. We do real work. We shoulder tremendous responsibility. We are, in fact, the designers of the corporation. We wear the decisions made at this table. We're going to wear the CAT bylaw. We already wear the waste bylaw. So it's curious that when our wage weight is discussed around the table, we often hear a reference comparing us to, well, what a minimum wage worker would make. And there is no comparison between what we do and what minimum wage workers do, except with regard to the fact that we're part-time. We're part-time, but we're pretty high level. And so to try to satisfy our wage by saying, well, you're making maybe $1,000 more than minimum wage, or you're close to minimum wage, you should be satisfied. No, not for the work we do. Now, a second reason why our pay should be adjusted is the demands on us through our work are so random and time-consuming that if somebody needed a second job, honestly, I mean, in addition to the main jobs they have, so this is like a part-time second job, if somebody needed to supplement that by another job, it would be an impossible scheduling challenge. In fact, even to manage one job is sometimes an impossible challenge. I know my first 2 years on council, I was still working full-time as a teacher. I don't know how my colleague, Councillor Hollingsworth, does it, because in that job, there's absolutely no flex time. If in your job you have flex time, which I don't know how many of us do, then you can juggle the demands of council and maybe take on a third responsibility, but I really doubt it. And finally, We deserve a real wage because we're not figureheads, we're real workers. To work as hard as we do for as little as we get is actually to devalue the position and our work here at the council table. I think we have to establish and maintain a competitive edge so that we will have the strongest and the most representative council possible. And so I have some suggestions. The first one has to do with the loss of the 1/3 tax exemption, which is a considerable hit. Now, in your package that was given to you, there's a chart that shows that unless we make an adjustment, our take-home pay for 2019 is going to be less than our take-home pay for 2018. And I suggest that our take-home pay from 2018 was inadequate. Now, Ms. Bailey has worked out, and if you refer to the chart, she has worked out that in order to maintain the take-home pay as what it is, we would have to add or adjust our salary by $1,722.50, which means that our salary for 2019 would be $17,971.72. So that would be the first part of my motion. And the second part, though, has to do with the lack of comparative validity between us and other municipalities. I suggest we should take a second step, and I wish I could say we'll catch up to the average across the province, which, I mean, I will tell you it's actually $23,000, but I'd like to aim for $22,000 by the end of our term in 2022. Now, that won't catch us up to the average across the province. That will catch us up to last year's average. So we're still going to be considerably behind our comparator municipalities and the average across the province. But I think we have lost so much ground over the years. This is going to be a multi-year fix. And I hope the council that succeeds us, beginning in 2023, will continue this process of adjustments that are serious enough to help us catch up to our peers. So to do that, after having suggested that we add $1,700 to our current pay for 2019, if we add $1,342.80 to our rate for this year, that would make our 2020 pay $19,000, 19 and change. And if we add the same amount, $1,342.80 to our 2020 pay, then our 2021 pay would be $20,000 and $600 and some dollars. And then if we add the third time, $1,342 to that pay, by 2022, we will be receiving $22,000, which is last year's provincial average. Now, I hope, councillors, you won't be shocked, because I recognize that in relation to what we've done in the past, this is rather aggressive. But we can't be fair about our own selves, and not just ourselves, but this is the councillors that will come after us. I mean, we make a mistake sometimes. We refer to ourselves when we're encouraging a bylaw or some sort of legislation. But the fact is, this affects the value of the work we do, and it also affects the attractiveness of people coming into council. You know, right now, the only people who really can afford to work for the wages we do are, unfortunately, well, some really brave younger people, but for the most part, retired people with pensions. And so, you know, we talk about trying to make our councils representative of the population. You need financial security to give as much of your time as you do to this particular job. And if you don't have that financial security, you're experiencing a strain that you shouldn't feel. We need, I think, to fix this situation by instituting a fair wage rate, fairer, not fair yet, but I think within about 8 years, it could be fair. So I would ask my colleagues to support these two motions, or two parts of one motion. The first one being that we remedy the loss of the tax exemption for 2019 by adding to our base pay the $1,722.50. That would be the amount needed to maintain the wage we had in 2018. And then for the next 3 years to add $1,300 and some dollars, so that by 2022, our base rate will be $22,000. And since that is the end of our term, that's as far as I'd like to go. And I hope that in the future councils will continue. And I just want to apologize. I know last night I sent you this motion with the year 2018 referenced. And I was unsure about that. In fact, when I spoke to Ms. Bailey today, we can't reference 2018 without us going for a 2/3 vote here to see if we can undo what we legislated for 2018, because we made that decision in 2014. In 2014, we determined that we will add 2% a year, and so our current rate is $16,000 and some. And without this adjustment, it will be grossly less than that in terms of our take-home pay. So, councillors, I invite you to fix what I think are two problems with our remuneration.
Thank you, Councillor McDonald. Debate. Councillor Grant and then Councillor Hébert.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I think most people are aware of where I sit on this issue, and it's what Elaine's recommending is even less than I recommended 4 years ago, 5 years ago. My HR background, I did job evaluation plans, and all the criteria that are necessary to review what we do here indicates that we should be paid a heck of a lot more than we are. So this is an improvement, but it still isn't what this responsibility is worth. I know that the argument comes up, well, you knew what you were getting when you're going into it. Well, when I started at Domtar, I was making $2 an hour, and I was $40-some an hour when I left. So using that criteria, I should have been working for $2 an hour plus a little bit each. So it's not realistic. We got behind because the political nature of our position here. So I support this, and I think in the future, if it continues on after this next term, I think they should be looking at indicating what Elaine said, continuing this on. So I support this, Elaine, and
I have Councillor Hébert and then Councillor Dupel.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to start with a little bit of history. 5 years ago, this was an election issue. So 2 terms ago, or I guess 3 terms ago, the council of the day voted an increase, as Councillor Grant mentioned. Became an election issue. And as soon as we were elected, I think it was on meeting number 2, we turned down the pay increase. And I was one of those who said, yeah, let's turn down that pay increase. It's too much, it's too high. 2 weeks into my term of council. I learned quite quickly that there's a lot of work behind the position, work that I love to do and would do at any cost, at any wage, but realized it was a lot more than many of us expected. And so I'll be honest, I was there, I turned it down. And I want to mention we're not volunteers, and I like in Elaine's motion, she says we do real work. It's true. I think we all do very real work. We're expected to be experts on everything that comes across this table. We gladly are expected to be on the clock 24/7, whether that be in meetings and committees, events, grocery stores, and we do it with a smile. We're held to a pretty high standard by our residents, as we should be, and we're paid sometimes less than minimum wage. So in the month of June, I quickly did the math. We did a lot of work in June, and averaging, minimum 5 hours of week checking emails and things that aren't meeting related, we made certainly less than minimum wage. And there are certainly months that are maybe a little less heavy, but I think we should certainly address our wages now. And why it's so low now is because it is a bit of a controversial issue, and many terms of council decide, well, we'll just move this on to the next term of council, moved so that it doesn't become an election issue. And reality is, we're the only ones who can make this decision. We can't delegate this to anybody on the exterior of our circle here. I think it would be easier if we could. If we just asked Maureen, hey, could you just decide a number for us? That'd be great. Thanks. We can't do that. It's up to us and only us, and so we have to take responsibility for it and not just move it along to next councils. So I know that clearly none of us jumped into this because of the wage. We do this because we love what we do, but I think we need to address it because of future elections and future councils. And like Councillor Lane mentioned, this is really structured for the retired folks with a pension, folks with more time on their hands, and it's not structured for young people, young working people, lower income people, parents. It makes it very difficult. And then, like Elaine said as well, there are a few brave younger ones around the table, and we do work full-time jobs, and it does become a struggle to manage. And sometimes we miss work to be here, and that's fine. We understood this going into it, but making sure that we're compensated for it is important because we all have bills to pay. And the cost of living increases, yet our wages stay the same. And I'm not asking us to jump to wages as high as, if we look at Belleville is a comparator to our municipality, very close in population. They're making $30,000 a year. We make less, we're expected to make less than $13,000 this year. And so I'm not asking us to jump to $30,000. I think that's almost a full-time wage there, but I think what Councillor McDonald is recommending is very fair, and I hope that the rest of council agrees, and that future terms of council continue to address this in a mature way instead of just letting it slip until the next term of council, and so that we stop having to catch up and bring us to a really fair wage. Thank you.
Councillor Duppel, and then Councillor McIntosh.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So 5 years ago, I voted against the proposed pay wage that was there that got approved. And then after that election, I am the councillor who made the motion to overturn that pay raise, which was overturned. I appreciate what my colleagues have done, and I know that some people compare it to a job, that it is a job, that it isn't a job, but you know, I look at it as that we're here to represent the members of our community. I've known, I'll speak for myself, I've known year after year that I've served what the compensation was for council. And I hate to think that we would give ourselves, not comparing our hourly wages, but I would hate to think that we would give ourselves a much greater pay raise than we would our employees of the City of Cornwall, because we always keep them to a 1.5% or 2%. So I have a hard time proposing that we give ourselves a bigger raise, because I appreciate the employees, I appreciate my colleagues who do it, but as I said in the past, that I don't do it for what it pays. I do it because I have a passion to serve our community. I'm going to continue to have that passion to serve our community, but unfortunately I won't go back on my decision that I made. I will vote against the motion. I think that it's very, very important that we don't compare this to jobs, to my own job that I work 40 hours a week at. And, you know, I think as a person, as an individual, I had to make that decision whether or not, if the compensation wasn't something that was fair to me, then I needed to make that decision not to run again for City Council. So I will continue to stay on the track that I'm on, and that I will vote against the motion. I think that the 2% that we came up with, it's probably not the best scenario, but it's certainly showing our employees that we can lead by example.
Councillor McIntosh and then Councillor Gardner. Thank you, Councillor Duppel.
Second meeting of council, my first term, I believe I seconded that motion. I would vote against the 25, it was 25,000. I'd vote against that today, but this isn't 25,000. 2 terms ago, we voted to cut our expense accounts by $1,200. We froze our pay. You know how many people came and said, way to go, that was really good? 0. Not one person came up to me and said, boy, that was very nice of you, saved the corporation about $10,000. Nobody said it. I'm not trying to break any violin strings here, but with the losing the 1/3, my take-home pay would be $198 a week. I can't buy RSPs anymore, like a couple other counselors, so I lose that loophole. Of course, we all do it because we like it and it's passionate. It becomes a situation where Carrie Lynn and I sit on a board with members of county's council, and we know what they make. We sit on that board, they all get paid, we don't get paid. You know where our pay goes? To the city of Cornwall. Every year, the Raisin Region Conservation Authority writes out a check that our pay, and they give it, it goes back into the city of Cornwall revenue, general funds. So actually, we generate income for the city. Small, but I have no problems with this plan. You know, many, many years ago, there was a councillor who always voted against pay increases, but always took the pay increase. Can I ask the CFO a question? Can I refuse the pay increase? Could a councillor refuse the pay increase?
Through you, Madam Mayor, it's the majority of council, so if you choose to do something else with your pay, donate it, et cetera,
They can go to you and say, take off the $1,700 off my check and give it to the Arts Center. That could be done.
Absolutely.
Then you get a nice tax write-off. Okay. Again, I voted against 25,000. I thought that was really, it was a rich plan. This is far from that. This, I can accept this one. It's quite acceptable.
Thank you, Councillor Mack. Councillor Gardner.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think Councillor Grant, if you let us know where I stand on this, we're fighting for fairness for council compensation probably for 12 years. Every time it came up at the table, it was a 0.5%, a 1%, a 2%. Didn't even keep up with inflation. Just somebody said something about Belleville, 25,000. Aurora, which is the same size as Cornwall, was making $25,000 5 years ago. It's a salary. It's not a stipend. It's a I'm paying taxes, so it's a salary. If you want young people to run and replace this geezer down the road, then you better give them the compensation that they deserve for the work that we do. I don't miss committee meetings unless there's a valid reason. I don't miss other committee meetings unless there's a valid reason that's outside of council. We have provincial legislation now that we have to deal with that we didn't deal with before. We have meetings over provincial legislation. That didn't happen before. I have a 465-page report, which I went through, and this is probably the 3rd one this year. I read every word of it. That took me 4 hours, because I have to review stuff, and then I have to question people like administration and other councilors to find out whether I'm going in the right direction. And some of you know that I call, and I meet you on the street and I ask questions. We need to be fair with ourselves. I'm not worried. You know what? If it stays like this, maybe I'll run, because no younger people will run again. So, but in the report, it's argued that the level of remuneration, that limited remuneration and level of commitment required to serve on council are both barriers to attract younger and more diverse candidates to run for seats on municipal councils. In many cases, potential candidates choose not to run for local office because of the sacrifices that they have to disobey. I don't know how you guys do it, working at a job. I don't know how you. But be fair to yourselves, And there are people that'll complain, let them complain.
Those are all the speakers I have on the list. Councillor Bergeron and Councillor Townsend. Councillor Bergeron.
Thank you. Let me first say thank you for constantly, Councillor Carter, considering me as a young person. I really do appreciate it. I'm in my 40s.
I've been there.
Young on council.
No, I get it. And I want to start by recognizing, look, there are not a lot of human beings who get to vote on their own salary. Like, what a privilege we're talking about, right? Like for real. I just want to take a moment and just soak that in. We have to. It is the rule of law. It is how our corporation is set up. We have to discuss our own salaries. I don't get to do that in the private world. Nobody does. And so here we are in public. The media is here, and I hope they record what we're saying. I look at this, and to me, it's a very straightforward conversation. I am brand new here. I'm 9 months in. I think councillors are grossly underpaid for the amount of work that you're doing and that we do. Does that mean our salaries are wrong? Yes, I think that conversation needs to be had. I support the motion on the table. I think by 2022, we should be at the provincial average. I think it will encourage younger than me candidates to run for office. I think it is needed. No disrespect to anyone at this council. I really hope you appreciate that. I think one of the fundamental differences between me and other councillors here is that I think we have too many councillors. So when I look at us getting a raise, that's what you want to call it, I look at it more as an adjustment to come up with provincial averages. If we bring it up to $22,000, I just, at the end of the day, we're talking about making half of what they're making in Belleville right now. Half. We have a larger budget than in Belleville. I don't want to get personal, but I think the mayor is grossly underpaid as well. The amount of rate, that's not on the table right now. We're not discussing it right now, so I won't discuss it. But I think it's too low. I look at the fact that some councillors here make more than others. That's not reported often, but there are some boards that some councillors get money from and others don't. And to me, that's absolutely wrong. I think that needs to be relooked at. That is not in the motion, so I'm not going to challenge it. I support the motion. I will bring forward a motion, I think, for what I will call honorariums. I believe we have salaries, but an honorarium for boards. We sit on a lot of boards. By my count, there's 8 of them. 8 boards that need our opinions, that are not committees, that are boards, where we are providing governance. And governance matters. And that's what we're doing here today. So, as a councillor, I signed up for it. I knew the wage. I appreciate the political side of this. But when I ultimately look at all this, I think if we're looking at the best decisions for the city of Cornwall, councillors are underpaid. So I support the motion. I have some other motions to bring forward in the future as it relates to honorariums, as it relates to the mayor's pay, as it relates to the types of boards and committees we sit on. I'll leave those for another day, but for today, I support your motion. In 2022, I hope we have 100 people running for city council as a result of the decision we make today. Thank you.
Councillor Towndale and then Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Well, I recall last term whenever we voted down the raise that was put in by the council before us. And that one was a little interesting. A couple reasons. I recall the consultant's report that we had at the time, and for me it was a little flawed because it said that somehow the council of the city of Cornwall was also representing people who lived in South Glengarry and South Stormont. Well, they have their own councils, so I couldn't use that as a basis to justify it because to me that didn't make sense. Someone from South Glengarry is not going to call me for help. That doesn't work like that. Interestingly enough, I also remember that that time frame there was a group who had some of us sign a pledge. It wasn't a tax freeze. It was to do what we can to not raise taxes. But then I had a member come to me afterwards and say, hey, it's too bad you couldn't get that raise. I told the member, well, it doesn't work like that. You want me to keep taxes low, but then you want me to take a raise. I don't know how that works out. But in either case, you know, Councillor Bergeron called this a privilege to discuss your own salary. I think it's a curse in a sense, because, you know, I can equate this to what's going on at 24 Sussex. You know, this is the Prime Minister's residence, but nobody wants to touch it because it's a political hand grenade. No one wants to put money into it because they don't want to have to take the hit politically, and that's kind of where we are here. You know, we tried last term to have a committee look at our salary and maybe come up with viable suggestions and solutions, but that didn't even work. That unfortunately didn't go anywhere, and it's too bad because it's really hopeful we get something in front of us like that. When you look at our comparators, we are underpaid, there's no question. Our colleagues in South Glengarry and South Stormont make more than us. In fact, I believe in South Stormont they get a per diem per meeting they attend, so if they attend all their council meetings, they make a lot more than we do. Interestingly enough, I also noticed though that when it comes to expense accounts, that a lot of our comparators don't have them. And that was something that was brought up. Take the expense account, put that in our salary, and just call it a day. I don't think that's a bad idea realistically. I mean, we do use it sometimes for events, but it's a bit of a hassle because I have to order tickets or pay for tickets and submit a claim and get it paid out and whatnot, where if I just pay it up front for it, it's taken care of. It's not a big deal. In this case, you know, when the federal government announced its plan to take away a 1/3 tax exemption, I think their reasoning was that they were trying to target the big hitters in Toronto who pull down the same salaries as they do. You know, councillors in Toronto make upwards of $100,000, and 1/3 of that was tax-free. We make upwards of $15,000, and 1/3 of that was tax-free. So I don't like the way that came in because I don't know if that was the intent, but obviously that's what's capturing us here. It's a bit of a difficult decision. I didn't come in looking for a raise. I know what we're paid. When I've gone away for military training, I've waived my salary because I knew I would be ineffective as a counselor because I wouldn't be reachable. So I felt I shouldn't be getting paid when I wasn't able to do my job. So I've made less over the years than my colleagues. It's something I've accepted. This is something I'm really having trouble coming to terms with in trying to figure out what's best. Because yes, I do believe that counselors should be paid more because I believe it would attract better talent to run for council. I do think that it creates a disadvantage. When you look at what people spend in an election campaign to win that campaign, it's exorbitant in some cases. I think I spent way too much money, but there are people who want to run for council who can't afford that, and that almost automatically excludes them from participating. And in the same vein, you know, if they take a hit where they're not able to work another job out of this salary isn't enough to sustain them either. So on that basis where I'm trying to wrangle with this, I think in the end I'm going to abstain when it comes to the vote. That's where I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Townville. Councillor Hollingsworth and then Councillor Bennett.
Your worship, I'm good, thanks.
You sure?
Yeah, it's fine. Carry on.
Councillor Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I remember the 2014 election and how the raise had become an issue. And Councillor Bergeron was saying that it's actually a privilege that we get to discuss our own salaries. I don't think we should be discussing our own salaries. I think we should be discussing the next term's salaries. Is what I think we should be doing. 22,000, I don't have any problem at all with what is in your motion. Everything I agreed with. The only thing I don't agree with is that we're doing it to ourselves. At least in the 2014 election, the councillors of the day weren't voting for themselves, they were voting for the next group. And then the next group decided, we don't want it. Some say that was a mistake, that's fine, but that's the way it played out. So to set it at $22,000 to be there for 2021 is basically what the salary would be going into 2022, which is the election. So if we want to do this, and I would probably vote in favor of it if it were setting it for the next group, not ourselves. I just don't think we should be voting a raise for ourselves for 3 years. I think to do it properly is to put it off to the next term. We're not giving ourselves a raise, and we're giving people 3 years to let us know how they feel about it. Because I was very vocal in the last election campaign in 2014 when I ran that I supported that increase, and I'm pretty sure that cost me some votes, and I'm okay with that. I don't have any problem with taking a hit for a decision I made, but I think it was done properly then. It was done for the next council and not for themselves. So if that was to come up to set this for the next council, I would support 100%, not to support ourselves. Thank you.
I'm fine, Your Worship.
Councillor Hollingsworth?
Carry on, as they say.
All right. So, I have been one of those councillors that has not voted for increases in the past. And as Councillor Bergeron correctly noted, this motion has nothing to do with the mayor's salary, so it's strictly on the councillor pay. I'm just thinking of June. I have June 2019 in my mind, and I look back on that month, and what the 10 of you did during that month was nothing short of absolutely exceptional. There were 2 council meetings. There was a planning advisory meeting. There was a team building session on the weekend. There was a strategic planning where we're visioning for the entire city over a several-year program. And then we had a meeting, a historic meeting with Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. That's just June. That's not even January, February, March, April, May. You all more than earned your pay and were quite frankly underpaid for the work that you have put in. So I am going to support this motion. And I will say this, though, and I want to turn to Councillor Bergeron here, because I feel, like you mentioned, quite strongly about the size of council for the city of Cornwall. I really think that there are too many councillors for the size of city we have compared to what is going on in other municipalities. So I am going to support the increase, but I am going to make sure that we have some serious discussions, upcoming discussions, around the size of council. So I am tying those things together, because I think that we would have more effective, more nimble, more effective leadership if we had, and more cost-effective leadership if we had fewer members around the council table. I sat there for 12 years, I'm sitting here now, and I'm getting that perspective, and I'm feeling more and more strongly about that. Now, I note that Councillor Towndale made a motion way back in January. It's on the unfinished business list, so we are going to be looking at that. I suspect, and I think your intent, Councillor Towndale, was to not only discuss the ward system, but also council size. Is that correct?
Yes, Madam Mayor, if I may, because I feel they're part and parcel. You know, if we're gonna look at wards and we're gonna determine, if we go to wards, then we're gonna need to determine the number of councillors too, I believe. So I don't think you can separate the two. So that was my intent as well, because if we're gonna have a discussion on the size of council, we may as well look at wards at the same time. At least that's my feeling.
Okay. So I am going to support the motion, and I'm going to look forward to our discussions around council size. And now I'm going to turn back to Councillor Elaine McDonald to wrap up before I call for the vote.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I'd like to address some of the comments that my colleagues have made. And the first one, Councillor Bennett's proposition that we don't make a decision now, but that we wait till 2022 and make a decision that would affect the next council. I think we have seen years and years and years of doing that. And I disagree with Councillor Bergeron in that we shouldn't be deciding our own salary. We're not deciding our own salary. We're deciding what the work we do at this table is worth. And we're doing it for councillors, like in the abstract, as well as the individuals around the table. Like, we just have to be able to make decisions without being self-referential all the time. So I think this isn't so much a privilege as a responsibility, and it's a responsibility we have. We set the wages for 450-some people who work in this corporation, and we try to do so fairly, and so we have to set the wage for ourselves too. And I would accept Councillor DePel's saying that we should simply give ourselves a cost of living 2%, which is what we do with our employees. But it's not 2% of $15,000. Like, you can't be fair if the base pay is flawed, which in this case is. So if we were to continue with 2%, by 2022, we'd be making $17,009 or something like that. So that is just not adequate. And another the reason why we should do this now and not wait for 4 years is, as I spoke to one of the consultants, I met him by accident, who came, and he was the fellow who suggested we go to 25,000 4 years ago, I guess it was, Councillor McIntosh, whenever that was. And he said what municipalities across the province are doing are something called making it whole. The fact that we lost that big exemption gives us the obligation, not just the opportunity, but the obligation to look at our compensation overall and to make it whole. And I think in terms of the work we do, the responsibility we bear, minimum wage is not fair and is not whole. And I think giving our, this adjustment is a step in that direction. And believe me, folks, it's only a step. We go to 22,000. By 2022, we will have reached the average across the province in 2018. So, like, we're not leaping ahead here by, great strides, but we are taking a step to bring in needed adjustments to make the compensation of councillors fair. And another point that hasn't come up, I think I made it badly in my discussion of how much time we spend doing the work we do, and that prohibits us from taking another job. We're not just not representative in that many of us are seniors on pensions. We all own our own cars. Most of us own our own houses. We are not the average Cornwallite. We're better off. Until we make the wage for doing this work competitive and appealing, we're never going to get people who rely on buses to get around taking a seat at this table because they can't afford to. If you really work for minimum wage, you can't afford to make this be your second job. So we have an obligation to make the pay here fair, and this will get us started on that process, but it won't complete it. And we'll know it's fair when we get people from all socioeconomic sectors of the population trying to get a position here. I think that's probably all I wanted to say. One of my colleagues mentioned that, the consultant who spoke to us there 4 years ago said that, in a sense, we represent South Glengarry and South Stormont. In a sense, we do, in that we, as a service manager, we do have responsibility for some of the policies that affect those counties too. So, in effect, we actually do more than our colleagues in South Glengarry, for example, who make considerably more money than we do. So I just say that we have to address the issue of lack of fairness. The fact that we've lost the tax exemption gives us the opportunity and the obligation to do it now. And I think that it's our responsibility to do so. And I encourage my colleagues to support this motion. And don't let this be the end of it. In 2022, when we're looking ahead to the next 4 years, whether I'm with you or not, I hope you will keep the same principles of fairness in mind and continue the adjustment. Because, as I said, this is only going to catch us up to what the average was making last year. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McDonald. I'm going to call the vote.
Recorded vote, Madam Mayor.
Councillors Claude McIntosh,
Oui.
Elaine McDonald,
Yes.
Sid Gardner,
Yes.
Dean Hollingsworth,
Yes.
Kathleen Nabar,
Yes.
Councillors Modest Dupet,
No.
Glenn Grant,
Yes.
Todd Bennett,
No.
Councillor Towndale,
Abstention.
Councillor Bergeron,
Yes.
and Madam Mayor.
It passes. I want to thank you all for that particularly challenging debate. It is clear that every one of us loves what we do. Thank you for that.
Our next report is the cuts to public health units. Recommended that council remove the cuts to public health units item from the unfinished business listing.
Counselor Gardner, seconded by Counselor Dupel. Any discussion? All in favor?
Just hang
Oh.
on a second.
Oh, sorry, Counselor Gardner?
I'm supporting your recommendation because I need to say that the province makes some major mistakes in their calculations, and they made there were numerous issues that the province didn't thoroughly think of. There were, one issue I'll give as an example is that they wanted to amalgamate us with Ottawa. Doing that meant that people from the counties and from Cornwall who would be part of the Ottawa group would end up causing a problem with Ottawa because they're all municipal employees and they're unionized. And they would not accept people from outside making a stipend and gas in their mix. But that was just one little example of things that they didn't do right. AMO, most municipalities, health units, health groups like Alpha and Como all went to the province and says, you're wrong, you need to change this, back up a little bit, and then I'll just say, stay tuned, because there's more coming down the pipe, probably in a year.
Thank you, Counselor Gardner. All in favor? Carried.
Communication item 1, tax write-offs and adjustments. Recommendation is that council approve the tax write-offs, adjustments, vacancies under sections 357 and 364 of the Municipal Act.
Motion? Counselor Grant, Counselor Towndale, any questions, discussion? All in favor? Carried.
Our next item is the Drinking Water Quality Management System Operational Plan, recommending that council endorse the Drinking Water Quality Management System Operational Plan.
Motion? Counselor Gardner, Counselor Grant, any questions or comments? Other than just say that we rock in terms of drinking water. Thank you.
A nice cue.
All in favor? Carried.
We're going to go back to our consent item 3, request to designate the waterfront trail as a smoke-free zone, with the recommendation that council refer this matter to administration for reporting.
So moved by Counselor Gardner, seconded by Counselor Bennett. Discussion. Counselor Grant and then Counselor Bennett.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I separated this because I won't support, send it to administration for a report.
Okay.
To me, this is a no-brainer. We don't have to have administration tell us that we don't want smoking on our trails. If you go along the trails, it's bad enough with the goose dropping, just see butts all over the place, and it looks disgusting. And so, as far as I'm concerned, we should vote on this tonight. We don't need a report from administration, so I'll vote against it. Then I'll bring a motion forward that we accept the recommendation.
Thank you. Counselor Bennett, and I think Counselor Hollingsworth?
I'm debating,
Okay, Counselor Bennett first, and then Counselor McIntosh.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. When I saw this, I thought of the people that live on either side of the college that I've been speaking to about the fact that when the college made their campus smoke-free, the problems they now incur. So I went to this one person's house in particular that lives on the west side of the college, and a very nice property, littered with cigarette butts. Even though there was pails right by the entrance to the college, that little gate along the bike path, there's pails there unused. So people were coming off the property, standing 10, 15 at a time and just chucking butts. And this woman's got younger kids, and in the winter she's out there picking butts out of the snow so her kids can play. So if there was no smoking anywhere along that path, I think that would create a much nicer atmosphere for the people who are living outside of zones that have banned smoking on their property. If you go the other way, cigarette butts are going into the river. I'm pretty sure the River Institute would be standing here telling you how unhealthy that is. They're fighting butts and fish. It's just not a healthy situation. So if that whole stretch was made smoke-free, we're going to alleviate a little bit of that. I mean, it's one of those things where it's going to be very tough to enforce, but I think once we're creating habits. So let's start there on the property we can control and give these people on either side of a smoke-free area a little bit of a break.
Thank you. Councillor McIntosh and then Councillor Gardner.
Very interesting when we pass these things, how much thought is given to how we enforce them. Is signage involved in this? So we have to put up signs, no smoking in this area? Yep. Who enforces it? Is Chris overworked bylaw officers take over?
Cats and cigarettes.
Buy them bicycles, Chris? Are you out there?
Mr. Rogers?
Through you, Madam Mayor, in I think it was January 1, 2014, where municipalities were formally responsible for smoking enforcement, that was taken away from us by the province when they implemented the updated Ontario Smoke-Free Act. So right now, provincial responsibility for smoking lays with municipal facilities like this, where you're not supposed to smoke within 9 meters of these entrances and so on and so forth. So it would sit with the province. That said, increasingly municipalities, Kingston was one of the latest, they're recognizing that the province has limitations on staff and resources and enforcement and so on and so forth, and they are taking it upon themselves to authorize themselves, and apparently it's legally sound, they're authorizing themselves at a municipal level to enforce provincial statute, which is what the Ontario Smoke-Free Act is.
Back to you.
Yes.
Have you got the manpower to do this?
Through you, Madam Mayor, once again, I don't know of any municipality that has the man or person power to be enforcing all the bylaws. Certainly, if you have a bylaw, the expectation you have is that you enforce it. And certainly, as far as the bylaw division is concerned, yeah, it's piling on.
Yeah.
But part of this, there again, is about community expectations and sending a message that this is unacceptable, and yes, they are, punitive penalties for it if you are caught doing it. To catch someone throwing a cigarette, but to start with, is one thing. As bylaw officers, there again, we do not have the authority to arrest.
No, you can't even ask for their ID.
We try, we have that right, we ask, but they can deny us that, because we will often say to them, sorry, sir, madam, you have just contravened whatever, bylaw. Can I have your driver's license, please?
I think we're getting off topic a bit, but anyway, go back to the issue that we'll do it, and I'll support this, but the enforcement, the expectations shouldn't be too high when it comes to enforcement, and we have to invest in signage. Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Hollingsworth and then Councillor Ibach.
Yeah, why not? I'm gonna probably not support the motion, Your Worship, just because of what was, well, two reasons. First of all, I don't think we can enforce it. And I don't think I want to be sending bylaw enforcement officers down the bike path potentially by themselves without support, trying to tell people to butt out. I don't see that as a real scenario for them nor for the municipality. And I realize you say, well, let's just pass a bylaw and that'll just fix everything. And we've already gone with the cat one, which I'm not sure we'll be able to implement. Now we're going to throw this one out there. Why don't we just pass a whole bunch of bylaws and we'll just hope for the best? I don't think that's the way a municipality should operate. So that's the first reason. The second thing is that while I can appreciate homeowners in certain circumstances having issues with smokers, and so maybe that particular spot needs to be a smoke-free spot, but we've got an awfully significant chunk of waterfront here and reasonably limited human resources to manage that over and above a myriad of other bylaws to contend with. And lastly, Your Worship, we've gotten to a point now where it's like people who smoke are like we're almost treating them in the sense of criminals, in the sense, if people were smoking indoors and I'm breathing in their smoke, that's a health hazard to me. I can totally appreciate that. And I suppose you can argue that fish are eating cigarette butts, valid, but they're eating a lot of other things, plastic water bottles amongst the whole myriad of things. And we don't seem to say, okay, well, let's make the bike path plastic-free, and maybe we should. Perhaps that's that one I would actually support more than the cigarette butt one, quite frankly. But my point is, it's not a criminal activity to smoke. It's not risking someone's health, at least not directly, I suppose indirectly perhaps. But the biggest issue is that we can't, I don't think, enforce this bylaw, period. And it doesn't make sense to me to make a bylaw that we have no reasonable expectation to be able to enforce. So I'm going to not support this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor
Madam Mayor, I just want to remind everyone that the motion on the floor at the moment
To receive.
is that council refer the matter to
No,
administration.
I don't want to do it.
Oh. I'm allowing the discussion. Councillor Hébert and then Councillor McDonald.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tidbit of information. Cigarette butts are the most littered item in the world, and the filters are made of plastic, and so when they are littered, which, I mean, everywhere I go, people just on the ground, and it just drives me bananas, even if they're near a garbage can. Anyways, it is not just plastic that they are putting into our environments. It is nicotine, heavy metals, chemicals, etc., which then make it to our waterways. So preventing that from happening would be excellent, and I understand that enforcing it is difficult, but putting up some signs will reduce it, I would imagine, just like things like, speed limits won't stop everybody from speeding, but it reduces the amount. So at least, if we can enforce it all, it'll discourage people from putting out on our waterfront.
Thank you. Councillor McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I'm really grateful to hear my colleagues' comments about how proliferous cigarette butts are and how dangerous they are. In fact, at the FCM conference that we attended in the spring, Madam Mayor, I attended a session on greening one's community, and I'm pretty sure it was Vancouver did an experiment to try to get cigarette butts off the ground because they are totally non-biodegradable and they're loaded with poison. They actually bought bags of butts from people who would collect them. People did collect them. And it was an experiment, and even though they discontinued the practice at some point, the fact is they heightened public consciousness so much that people experienced less butts being just tossed around because people just think, okay, it's just a little thing. But, if you put some public policy behind it and let people know that it's not just a little thing, then people react. I don't think you have to catch every malefactor to get the point across that this is not a good behavior. I think just putting it out there, the education, the sign, that has an effect. Not as much maybe as $100 fine or something, but it does have an effect because it educates the public. And I think that's how we change behaviors. So now, I'm a little bit lost. Does Councillor Grant's motion only it's only if this one fails, will he introduce that?
Correct.
Did I clarify? Okay. So, well, that
motion.
makes
No,
me-
it's not Councillor Grant's motion, but if this one fails, Councillor Grant will make a motion.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we'll get to the same place in 2 weeks or a month when this comes back, so I'm going to support the motion.
Councillor Gardner?
Through you, Madam Mayor, I'll support the motion because it's dear to my heart. I lost an election over smoking. And when I'm on my bicycle and I see somebody go by on a bike with a cigarette in his mouth, I wonder how healthy this guy is, or this girl is. I had a teacher who once said if we were meant to smoke, we'd have been born with chimneys on our heads. So I still believe that today.
Thank you. So I'm going to, Councillor McIntyre?
Just a clarification.
Yes?
Is smoking in Lamoureux Park permitted?
Madam CAO? Mr. Boileau?
Through you, Madam Mayor. I believe it is permitted. We've had requests for non-smoking in Lamoureux Park in the past. I
Not
just
around the
want
play structure, though, eh? There's no smoking
Sorry?
around the play structure?
That is correct.
Okay.
There are locations, I mean, for example, the Civic Complex and distance from there.
Right.
The play structures and distance from there. but generally it is not. The one thing I do want to point out, because I've been looking at some of the mapping, is that what could be very difficult to enforce on the enforcement side of things is that what is the geography of the trail? So the trail, I believe, is a fairly well-defined outside of Lamoureux Park, but in Lamoureux Park, of course, there are various paths. And so it appears that it's a fairly well-defined right along the water's edge. But is that actually, first of all, that needs to be identified, that is the waterfront trail. And secondly, you have to enforce that there is no smoking on the waterfront trail. Which means, of course, that if that's the case, you could smoke on the other trails in the park, which could be very confusing. I just want.
Subject to include in the report.
So well, if there is a report.
It seems that there will be, so.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Bylaw.
So
McIntosh?
we're gonna, no, you can't smoke on the bike path, but you can smoke beside the bike path if you're in Beguineville Park or Lamoureux Park.
There are locations where you cannot.
Generally.
You're correct.
So that doesn't make any sense. You know,
No.
there's a
Well, it's
4-foot strip you can't smoke on, but everywhere else you can.
Well, the buildings, of course, are dictated
Yeah.
by Ontario laws, and the play structures, of course, with children, et cetera, are,
Yeah,
that is why that is.
it's pretty, still a lot of area, you know, where.
Yep.
Okay.
So the motion was to request a report. Madam Clerk, allow the discussion. This council is earning their pay tonight, so it's all good. All in
Past my
favor
bedtime.
of the motion?
The motion is that, just to get a report.
Is to request a report. Against? Carried. No need for another motion, Councillor Grant, but there will be further debate when the report comes out.
I was gonna bring in the marijuana too, that's gonna.
No, Councillor Grant.
Past my bedtime.
Madam Clerk.
2019 Municipal Works Redevelopment Plan Report. Recommended that council receive this report.
Motion? Councillor Towndale pulled this one out of consent, I think.
Questions?
Okay.
I can make the motion to.
Councillor Towndale makes the motion, seconded by Councillor Elaine McDonald. Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to thank administration for the report. It's very detailed. I appreciate time and effort went into it. It's also presented very well. I still have some concerns. I understand the reasoning for some cost overruns, which was explained. In other cases, it was not. For example, the paragraph that talks about the grading and the parking lot and whatnot explains how the items were combined, but doesn't account for the fact that it was 1.3 million over budget. My further concerns that I have here, a chart was prepared, and I want to say this, actually I should start by saying this. Listen, I understand that the initial costs were cost estimates. I get it. These were presented to us as ideas of what the project might cost, and the first one's done by AECOM. They were just a general ballpark idea. 2018, we received something during budget deliberations that was a bit more finalized based on those numbers. And, a couple months ago, we received new numbers. But the reality is, when you're talking about changing numbers for budget, when there's such a drastic change, that's where my concern is. It's one thing to make an estimate and you're off by, a couple $1,000s, maybe for a larger item, tens of thousands of dollars, but still a minuscule amount, say like 5%, 10%. But in this case, you're talking about a lot of variation. The salt shed's a good example. It's been explained, but you have something that was estimated at $1 million, now it's $4 million. But beyond that, I get the justification for that. But when I'm looking at this now, so we have the original cost estimate by AECOM, we have the 2018 budget report estimate, we have the June 2019 estimate, and now we have an August 2019 estimate. So, for example, if I look at the year 2020 in the combined chart, this is on page 12 of the report. The last item here, for example, construct administration building. So the first estimate was 2.9 million. The second estimate, and there was a $5 million contingency for the whole project. The second estimate was 2.9 million. There's a $5 million contingency for the project. In June, it was estimated to be 2.5 million with no contingency. And now, as of this report, it's estimated as 1.8 million with a $3 million, just under $4 million contingency. That doesn't make sense to me, because how do you say this building will cost 3 million, 2.5, and now 1.8? You know, and the contingency numbers fluctuate in there, so it doesn't make sense to me. Another example, 2023, construct heated storage module, first estimate 4.7 million, again 4.7 million, then 4.9 million in June. Now we're estimating it'll be 2.9 million. And we were saying that the contingency was built into it in June, but in 2018 it was not built into it, and now the price has gone down. Like, to me, that doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. You know, I'm not a rookie around this table necessarily. Yeah, I'm in my 5th year, it's only my 2nd term, but I've seen a lot of budget items come forward. We've done some massive projects over the last number of years. I'd say in the last year, we've definitely undertaken our share. Doesn't answer my questions entirely. I don't think it justifies these numbers. These new numbers they're just out there in my opinion. So I would like to refer this to the audit committee, and I'd like our auditors to take a look at this. If I can get a seconder for that motion.
Councillor Bergeron seconds the motion. Councillor Bergeron would like to speak to the motion? Or-
Yes, I would. I probably would have made the motion myself, thank you. I'm going to simplify what I think Councillor Towndale was saying. I don't understand why something that's that far over budget doesn't come back to council instead of being a report. So maybe that's me not understanding the process, but when we're talking about, this is a 30-some million project, we passed the budget, and it's not in the budget, so it should come back to us. And so until I have a real explanation of why that is, I support this motion. I want to find out really what's going on here. I don't think, I understand it's a complicated, big project, but I think we need some answers before we just say, yeah, that's okay, this report is approved. So I support the motion fully.
Any further debate on the motion? Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Not so much debate as a question. I just wonder if the manager who's overseeing the project might offer some comments that satisfy people's questions.
Before that, I just want to clarify. So we have a motion on the floor to receive the report. So if after this you'd like to make a motion, Councillor Towndale, for something else, then we'll go after that. And I will then consider Councillor Bergeron the second. Sorry.
I'll do that, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. DeWitt.
Through you, Madam Mayor. The only comment I have about this project, that it is evolving. It's complicated. There's a lot of background work that comes wasn't, and it's kind of elaborated in the report, that it wasn't spoken about in the original ACOM projections. And as we start working into it, then we find out that, and we start doing investigations, that it makes the project that much more complicated and that much more varied all the time. As we proceed, it continues to, and we evolve. And so it's difficult at times to go back and try to match that with the original ACOM projections.
Thank you. Any further comment, Councillor Brown? Response to that?
No. I appreciate that, thank you.
Further debate on the motion?
What is the motion?
The motion is to receive the report. Are we okay to receive the report? All in favor? Carried. Councillor Towndale.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I will put forward a motion that we refer this project to the audit committee so that the auditors can take a look at the financials.
Seconded by Councillor Bergeron. Oh, sorry.
The audit committee or the city's auditors?
Why? Because the auditors report to the audit committee, I feel it should go to that committee. Does that make sense?
I'll turn to Madam CEO or the CFO. Does that make sense for it to be referred to the audit committee?
I think that if it gets referred to the audit committee, there's going to be a couple of steps. So it'll get referred to the audit committee. The audit committee, as a committee, would then make the decision to refer it to the city's auditors. We would get an engagement letter. They would produce a report. It would come back to the audit committee. I think that that is a good process, by the way, although there's an initial meeting, because there's other members of the audit committee, so you'd want to get them up to speed on what the matter is. So my suggestion would be, do you want the auditors to come directly to council, or do you want to engage the audit committee? And if we put it through the audit committee, then that's just a slightly different step in the process.
I think the audit committee, with respect to council, I think it'll come back here eventually, but at the same time, I don't want to tie up council meetings with it consistently. Where we have a committee that specializes in it, at least it specializes in this, I think that's the right place to put it.
Full disclosure, Councillor Towndale is chair of the audit committee, and Councillors Bergeron and myself sit on the audit committee, along with lay appointments. Correct?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Further debate on the motion then to refer to the audit committee. Councillor
If I
Elaine
could
McDonald.
just ask Mrs. Adams to repeat what she said about the preference of going to the audit committee rather than the auditors. I didn't follow everything you said.
So if council refers the matter to the audit committee, what administration will do is we will call an audit committee meeting. We will update the audit committee because there are lay appointments on that committee. We would then look to our members of council that are on the committee to also update the lay appointments, to make a recommendation on the audit committee to put it to our auditors. The CFO and myself would work through that. We would get an engagement letter from our auditors. They would do the review. The initial report would be brought back to the audit committee. From the audit committee, they could make a recommendation then that report gets brought back to council. So further to Councillor Towndale's comments, it allows that item to get worked through that committee format, separate from council, and then probably in 4 to 6 weeks' time, that matter would come back to council. It's not going to come back to council maybe in 1 or 2 meetings. It's probably going to take,
Yeah,
it's going to take more time than that.
but it would go through the auditors as well.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Your Worship. One of the concerns I always have when things go to kind of subcommittees is that the subcommittee discusses it and they decide what they think about it, and then it just kind of stays at that level. And I think that we as a council, at least I, would like to hear what they think, or what kind of has been flushed out. What assurance do we have as councillors that whatever the audit committee and our city auditors determine will eventually get back to it? How do I know I'm gonna eventually see what's come of it?
So first of all, our committee, like the audit committee, meetings, minutes are always form part of council's agenda.
Okay.
So the audit committee, I believe the intention this evening is that the audit committee refers this matter to our auditors. A report will come back. Further to your point, I think the expectation from the audit committee would be, once they've had an opportunity to better understand the outcome of the audit from our auditors, then a report would come back to city council. So the question I would have for council is, do you want the audit committee to do more of the legwork on the matter and then have a report come back to council? Or does council want to get the same level of detail that the audit committee would receive? It's still going to come back to council.
Well, I'm only one councillor. I don't necessarily need to see every little nitty-gritty thing. I don't necessarily even need to see what an auditor says. But I do want to know what the kind of outcome, or if there's a recommendation, or if there's we think this is what's going on. Am I to assume then that whatever the minutes or a report would then be placed on a council agenda to be received by council, and then we can debate or discuss or do whatever? Does that make sense?
Through you, Madam Mayor, yes, you should anticipate that. What the committee will do is spend a greater amount of time going through that. So similar to our year-end audit report, our management letters, there are hours that are spent in those meetings to go through the details and understanding of that and what comes back to council. And it could be that the audit committee might also decide either the auditor's report comes back to council, or maybe the audit committee could make a recommendation that the auditors make a presentation to council.
Now, the last point is what kind of, I mean, I realize that it sounds like there's a lot of steps going on here, balls in the air, if you would. Realistically speaking, when could we as a council expect to see some kind of report on this particular item? Because the rest of the stuff, I get the committee has their thing, they do whatever. This one seems to be, it's not nice and clean. Realistically speaking, when could we as a council expect to see that on our agenda? November, October?
I think you could anticipate seeing it on an agenda potentially in October. I
Okay.
think before November. I think we'd want to also get it on an agenda before we get into the budget process, or in line with the budget process, so that council feels comfortable going into the 2020 budget. What will happen is we'll need to try to coordinate a meeting. Once we get that meeting coordinated, depending if it takes a couple of weeks, it's still, we're kind of in summer season, depending on people's availability. And then it's also determining engagement from our auditors. We probably could ask our auditors for an engagement letter or proposal, understanding that this is the direction, so we have it at that audit committee meeting. And then we'd have to set up a timeline for the auditors to come in and do the work, which I think would be, it shouldn't be a significant amount of time. It probably could be done, I think, in a couple of days, depending on the scope of work. And then we would take it back to the audit committee, and the audit committee would decide whether or not that is sufficient for their review, if they're looking for more information, or whether it can come forward to council. So I would say that if we said October, it should be enough time. I think September, end of September might be doable, but October probably is very doable.
Fair enough. That being said, then either to you, your worship, or to the clerk, can this be added on to our agenda as unfinished business? Because technically, that motion is made, it wasn't part of our agenda. We could, I mean, we lumped it in before we get to new business, but in essence, that's what it kind of is.
Madam Clerk?
If I may, Madam Mayor, if there was a slight amendment to the motion, just by adding for a report, it would go under the emergency, and it would automatically come back to council.
Well, I guess I can ask that to the mover, just because I'd like to keep a running record as to when, sometimes, your worship, these things kind of, they just fall kind of away. People lose track, myself included. Whereas if it stays on our agenda, at some point, somebody, myself, can say, hey, what's going on with this? So,
I have a feeling we won't be losing track of this
well,
one.
I don't think so either, but, so
If the
mover and seconder are okay
Right.
with that, just so that I can have it
Yep.
kind of as a record.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth.
Yeah, I'm fine with that, Madam Mayor. I mean, realistically, as you mentioned, I'm the chair of the committee, and I think at the end, we'd be recommending the report back to council. That's my
Absolutely.
intent, but I'm happy to add that amendment to make it that much
It makes me feel warm and furry.
Seconder agrees, so we'll go that way.
Fuzzy.
Any further debate on this motion? Councillor Gardner?
I have one question through you, Madam Mayor. Mr. DeWitt doesn't sit on the audit committee, but would he be able to be a part of those discussions so that when we do ask him questions, he has direct answers
Right.
from the audit committee or the auditor?
Madam CEO?
Through you, Madam Mayor. So Mr. DeWitt and part of his team would also have a fairly big role to play, working with our auditors to provide them with background information so they can conduct a review. We would likely share that information with Mr. DeWitt and his department. Whether or not they're part of that audit committee meeting, I think we would work through that. If it makes sense for them to be there to be able to assist with responding to questions from the committee, we would absolutely want them to be present.
Because with all due respect to Mr. DeWitt, I know he's got a lot on his plate, and it seems to me that if he sat at that chair and we started asking questions, if he knew what happened with the audit committee, that he be able to directly answer us.
Right,
Thank you.
thank you. Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion? Against? Carried. Next item, Madam Clerk?
Tenders and requests for proposals. Our first item is a request for quotation 19225, supply of tree services, package E, 2019, with a recommendation that this quotation be awarded to Davy Tree Expert Company of Canada Limited from Ancaster at the total bid price of $29,021.32.
Motion? Counselor DePel, Counselor Elaine McDonald, any discussion? All in favor? Carried.
Request for proposal 19P10, landfill full cost accounting analysis, financial stability report, recommending that this RFP be awarded to DFA Infrastructure International Incorporated from St. Catharines at the total bid price of $33,849.15.
Moved by Counselor Bennett, seconded by Counselor Towndale. All in favor? Carried.
Tender 19T54, supply and delivery of a new tandem axle truck with snowplow attachments. Recommending that this tender be awarded to Rush Truck Centers from Cornwall at the total bid price of $339,311.70.
Moved by Counselor Gardner, seconded by Counselor Elaine McDonald. All in favor? Oh, sorry. Counselor Towndale, question?
Sorry, Madam Mayor, just a quick question. I assume the unit it's replacing will be put up for surplus auction.
Madam CFO?
I will have to defer to.
Sorry, the question again?
The unit it's replacing will be put up for surplus auction.
That is true, yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
All in favor? Carried.
Tender 19T55, supply of winter road sand and sand fill. Recommend that this tender be awarded to Cornwall Gravel from Cornwall for a 2-year period for option B commencing September 1st, 2019 to August 31st, 2021, at the total bid price of $78,540 excluding HST.
Moved by Counselor McDonald, seconded by Counselor Ribad. Any questions? All in favor? Carried.
Next item is a new business motion.
Not motion.
The new business has been distributed.
Oh, sorry, Counselor.
Oh, I just wanted to point something out, but can I
Go-
do it under new business?
Do you have a new business motion?
No, no. No.
So it has been distributed to council members, and in order to discuss it, this evening, a 2/3 majority vote will have to be passed. And the subject of the matter is a purchase of skateboard equipment. So we're looking for a 2/3 majority vote to discuss that.
So we need a motion to discuss this because we've already discussed it. So Counselor McIntosh, Counselor Elaine McDonald. So does anybody need any discussion on that? Counselor McDonald?
Yes, thank you.
This is on the 2/3 majority.
Sorry?
This is on the 2/3, just to bring discussion. Okay. All in favor that we discuss this tonight? Did you count that? 2/3? It passes. Thank you.
Need to move a motion for the 11 o'clock.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I know.
I was
No,
planning
you've been
to Saturday
very,
night,
you've
or-
been very patient. So I want speakers on the motion. Counselor Towndale,
Yeah.
do you want to make the, are you clear or do you want to go to debate?
I can read the motion.
Okay,
Yeah, that's probably
Okay.
the best.
okay.
Whereas the municipality of North Dundas has declared its skateboard equipment surplus, and whereas the current skate park equipment in the city of Cornwall needs replacement. Whereas the North Dundas equipment offers an opportunity to improve a city of Cornwall asset and increase recreational opportunities for youth. Therefore, be it resolved, the administration acquire this equipment, and that administration is authorized to spend up to $15,000 from funds that they deem appropriate for this purchase.
Counselor Towndale, did you want to discuss that?
Yes, I think Councilor Grant, you had agreed to second the motion,
Okay.
just for the record.
Is it already seconded? No.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, it wasn't when you got the, okay. Seconded by Counselor Grant, thank you.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do apologize for bringing this forward in this manner, but it's a time issue that created this. It was brought to my attention on Friday that the municipality of North Dundas is selling its skate park equipment. It was brought to my attention by members of the skateboarding community, such as Claude Renier, who I think many of you know around the table. He's very involved and he's very experienced. He's a former Canadian champion. He has helped design skate parks in other cities, and he actually helped design a course at Algonquin College that teaches people how to design skate parks. So when it comes to sort of thing, I would argue that he's a subject matter expert on this, and he brought it to my attention. And he was on the skate park committee last year, and he was very active. And you know, that is one area that a need has been identified, a new skate park for the city. Our existing one is next to the Municipal Works Yard in Optimus Park, and it's not in great shape. I venture to think, so this equipment here is 10 years old. I venture to think ours is much older. I know it's damaged. There's other issues with it. It's out of the way. There's a lot of concerns. But in order to create a suitable replacement for that, something that's more modern, that would work better, and serve as a potential attraction to the city for skateboarders, similar to what the BMX park is doing now for BMXers, we would need to invest quite a bit of money. And that also takes political will, and that takes time. But the skateboarding community in the city has been waiting for a long time for some sort of replacement. So based on this, I think we have the opportunity to improve our services and take advantage of another municipality removing something from service. It's right now it is listed for auction. That ends in 10 days. The starting bid is $5,000, and it seems to be a good working order. I don't mean to speak on behalf of Councillor Grant, but I understand he made some inquiries into that earlier and found out that it does need some repair. However, the reason that they're not replacing it is because, or repairing it, the municipality feels that it's not used enough in order to justify the repair. Whereas I would argue here in the city it would definitely be used, so we can justify the repair. I feel that this is a great opportunity, as I mentioned in the motion, to provide a recreational opportunity for youth. It's classified as playground equipment as well. I know there's some questions on it, you know, where are the funds going to come from for this, where are we going to put it once we have it, and that sort of thing. But that's something I would look to administration for some advice and help with that. But I feel this is an opportunity that we should not let pass, and again, because it's already on the auction block, there's a time frame here that I would really like to act on quickly, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Any further discussion? Councillor Elaine McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do have a few questions. I want to say, first of all, I totally support us enhancing our skateboard park in any possible way we can, including moving it to a more central location. But I think that would be a very long process to do all that. So I'm wondering if I could ask the councillor through you, Madam Mayor, if the idea would be to simply replace our current park assets with this equipment now in place. And then later.
So I would like to have Mr. Wallow comment on this, or Mr. Fothrop as well.
Yeah, that'd be
Thank
great.
you. And then I'll go back to
I only have one comment to make, and then
Thank you.
I'll refer the only suggestion I would make, only because we're basing our information on a few photos and so on, is that it reads that it be resolved that administration acquire this equipment. And I'm suggesting perhaps that we may want to use the words pursue or consider acquiring the equipment. If we find out that it's not acceptable or that it has deficiencies, the motion says that we acquire it. So I'm simply saying that perhaps we may want to change that to pursue or
I'll go back to the mover in a minute. I'll hear from Mr. Fothrop.
Right.
Thank you. Oh, to the mic? Thank you.
Through you, Madam Mayor, Councillor Towndale's comments are fairly accurate when it comes to our skateboard park. It is somewhat less than ideal. It's more for, I'm not a skateboarder myself, but my comments from people like Mr. Renier is that it's more of for sort of street sort of style skateboarding with tricks. And he said it's a large asphalt pad with some features that are rather spread out. He said there's more features within that space, so depending on the condition of the equipment, for sure it could be a welcome addition to what we've got currently. I know the work with the skateboard committee was doing really had much grander visions than what we have at that park. Their visions would be a complete scrap of that, and what they're looking for was more sort of concrete sort of bowls and half pipes and a course, which, you know, this again, it's more just ramps and rails and jumps, so to speak. So again, I'm not familiar with what the Township of North Dundas has for sale, but as Mr. Wallow mentions, I think you know, if it's council's will, it probably warrants a review of it to see whether it's of suitable condition for reuse.
Thank you. Well, I'm reassured by that because I appreciate Mr. Boileau saying that we should evaluate the condition first, and that's essential. And then I gather that if it does pass muster, then what we would do is probably use it in our current park and just upgrade it a bit. This wouldn't be the major fix.
Through you, Madam Mayor, finding another location for it would be a challenge. I think ideally we would look to try and accommodate it within the asphalt pad that is in Optimus Park. I can't think of another location that comes to mind. A new asphalt pad or concrete pad will be quite costly, you know, in the $100,000+ of dollars. So again, you know, I think if something more grand were to be done, again, I think it's likely a complete redesign as opposed to taking on some second.
Well, I support this motion then as a temporary stopgap measure, even if that goes on for 10 years, which it well might. So the cost, I understand the Councillor Towndale to say that the price of this was $5,000. So I'm assuming that the other 10 is for installation and repair and that sort of thing?
Mr. Falker?
Either way, it's a bargain, I think.
Through you, Madam Mayor, difficult to comment. I haven't seen the equipment to know whether, you know, whether it's suitable even to use in the space, but like I said, definitely warrants having a look at.
I think it's a great initiative, well worth pursuing.
Thank you. Councillor Towndale, will you be okay with changing the wording?
Absolutely, Madam Mayor.
Seconder is Councillor Grant. You're okay with changing the wording? Okay. So I have Councillor Grant and then Councillor Mack on the speakers list.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I talked to a former politician from North Dundas, and he
Really?
anyway, he pursued this and checked with the department, and he said the equipment's in good shape, other than need some repairs. And they're not pursuing this because they would have to put a new pad down and repair the. So basically, I think I like the wording that Mark is suggesting, and we can go and look at it. It doesn't hurt to go and look at it and put a bid in. And I think it's going to cost about $5,000 to do the repairs on the equipment. So
Okay.
anyway, I think it's from what I heard, it's good. It would be a good buy.
Councillor McIntyre?
No, the point I was making, pursuing means going out and taking a look at it.
Any further discussion? All right. I believe time is of the essence in terms of this, so I will just say that our current skateboard park is not grand is an understatement. So any improvement would be a good thing. All in favor of the motion? Carried. Thank you, Mr. Falker. Mr. Boileau?
I have bylaws 2019-96 to 100 inclusive listed on the agenda to be taken as read and passed.
Moved by Councillor McDonald, Councillor DePel. All in favor?
Next section is the reports from standing and special committees of council.
Councillor McDonald?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd like to say a word on behalf of the arts community right now. As per custom, the BMO building will be open on August 23rd, which is the final art walk of the season, and we will be offering some musical entertainment. At 4:30 we'll have Ham's Jam and Tram, which is a kiddie participatory entertainment. It's wonderful. And then at 7 o'clock we'll have an open mic filled by students from O'Neill's studio downtown. But also, The BMO building is going to be open on August 17th and 18th. This is Doors Open, I think it's Doors Open Ontario or Doors Open Cornwall. In any case, we'll be there from 10 to 4 both those days, and we invite the public and anybody else to come through and check out the building. But then something that's really extraordinary, I think we're used to offering arts events there. On September 11th, the team from Hospice Cornwall has rented the premises to celebrate their 10th anniversary celebration. And it was 10 years ago that our council contributed greatly to the establishment of Hospice Cornwall. I think we gave them $500,000.
We did.
In spite of the fact that many people said we're not in the health business. This is beyond council's responsibility. I think it's a wonderful thing that we did it because our city has this asset. And now that team has rented the building at 159 Pitt to have their celebration. I'm sure the other councillors have all received an invitation to it. So what thrills me as one of the members working on this committee is that it underlines what the architects told us in that this building would be suitable for so many activities. And here we have a huge reception planned for September 11th, which is typical of what that building will be able to do when it's renovated. And I'm thrilled this group is doing it before then. Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Thank you. Councillor Bergeron.
Thank you. I really just wanted to point out that we just passed a bylaw saying that the World Junior A Challenge is coming to Cornwall in 2020. I think that's a really big deal. I think there's a lot of work behind the scenes that happened until it just kind of got passed through as a thing. So that is phenomenal. That's a big event, a really big event for the city of Cornwall. I will be front row center watching all these games. I'm very excited to see it come to Cornwall. Thank you.
It's good to be excited. Thank you, Councillor Bergeron. Any further comments?
Can I just make a comment?
Councillor McIntosh.
This is Norm Kendall's last meeting with us. He's retiring as administrator of the lodge, and I want to thank Norm for all his service to the community. Elaine, myself, and Glenn sit on the Board of Management, and we've really enjoyed working with Norm. He's done a good job, Norm, and enjoy retirement.
Did you want to make a comment?
Certainly, Madam Mayor. So Norm has been with us for a little over 8 years. And so he is retiring at the end of August for some people that may or may not be aware. So we have thoroughly enjoyed Norm as part of our senior team, participating in certain budget discussions, strategic planning, policy development. So I certainly have appreciated working with Norm, both in this role and my previous role. And I think we all wish him retirement. I think we're envious, looking at what's ahead of him, but thank you, Madam Mayor.
Félicitations, Monsieur Canville. Toujours tellement une attitude plaisante et respectueuse, surtout. On a beaucoup apprécié ton dévouement pour la ville de Cornwall. Thank you very much. Thank you. Anybody else? Next item.
We're not allowed.
Next item.
2 minutes.
Unfinished business listing for August 12th.
We need a motion. Councillor DePel, Councillor Grant, all in favor? Carried. Confirming bylaw.
Confirming bylaw.
Councillor Hollingsworth, Councillor Hébert, all in favor? Before we adjourn, I'd just like to apologize. I did not wear the chain of office.
Oh, my gosh.
Yes, Councillor Towndale highlighted. I don't know if that invalidates the entire meeting.
Oh, my God. Let's do it again.
Yeah, I've had a bit of a trying day, time, family, mom issues, health issues. So I completely forgot to put it on. I apologize. Sorry. Next time. Motion.
Sitting up a little straighter.
Yeah. Motion to adjourn. Councillor DePel, Councillor
With
Bennett,
a
all in
minute to
favor?
spare.
Thank you.
Just made it.
Shouldn't put the chain of office and then start.